Chapter 18 of Black Ivory by R.M. Ballantyne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18 describes some of the doings of Yoosoof and his men in procuring black ivory from the interior of Africa. A dirty shop in a filthy street in the unhealthy town of Zanzibar is the point to which we now beg leave to conduct our reader, whom we also request to leap in a free and easy way over a few months of time. It is not for the sake of the shop that we make this leap, but for the purpose of introducing the two men who, at the time we write of, sat over their grog in a small back room connected with that shop. Still, the shop itself is not altogether unworthy of notice. It is what the Americans call a store, a place where you can purchase almost every article that the wants of man have called into being. The prevailing smells are of oil, sugar, tea, molasses, paint, and tar, a compound which confuses the discriminating powers of the nose, and, on the principles that extremes meet, removes the feeling of surprise that ought to be aroused by discovering that these odours are in close connection with haberdashery and hardware. There are enormous casks, puncheons, and kegs on the floor, bales on the shelves, indescribable confusion in the corners, preserved meat tins piled to the ceiling, with dust and dirt encrusting everything. The walls, beams, and rafters appear to be held together by means of innumerable cobwebs. Hosts of flies fatten on, without diminishing, the stock, and squadrons of cockroaches career over the earthen floor. In the little back room of this shop sat the slave trader Yoosoof, in company with the captain of an English ship which lay in the harbour. Smoke from the captain's pipe filled the little den to such an extent that Yoosoof and his friend were not so clearly distinguishable as might have been desired. "You're all a set of false-hearted, wrong-headed, low-minded scoundrels," said the plain-spoken captain, accompanying each asseveration with a puff so violent as to suggest the idea that his remarks were round-shot and his mouth a cannon. The Briton was evidently not in a complimentary mood. It was equally evident that Yoosoof was not in a touchy vein, for he smiled the slightest possible smile, and shrugged his shoulders. He had business to transact with the captain, which was likely to result very much to his advantage, and Yoosoof was not the man to let feelings stand in the way of business. "Moreover," pursued the captain in a gruff voice, "the trade in slaves is illegally conducted in one sense, namely, that it is largely carried on by British subjects." "How you make that out?" asked Yoosoof. "How? Why, easy enough. Aren't the richest men in Zanzibar the Banyans, and don't these Banyans, who number about 17,000 of your population, supply you Arabs with money to carry on the accursed slave trade? And ain't these Banyans Indian merchants, subjects of Great Britain?" Yoosoof shrugged his shoulders again and smiled. "And don't these opulent rascals," continued the Briton, "love their ease as well as their money, and when they want to increase the latter without destroying the former, don't they make advances to the like of you and get 100% out of you for every dollar advanced?" Yoosoof nodded his head decidedly at this, and smiled again. "Well, then, ain't the whole lot of you a set of mean scoundrels?" said the captain fiercely. Yoosoof did not smile at this. He even looked for a moment as if he were going to resent it, but it was only for a moment. Self-interest came opportunely to his aid, and made him submissive. "What can we do?" he asked after a short silence. "You knows what the Sultan say, other day, to one British officer. If you stop slave trade, you will ruin Zanzibar. We must not do that. Zanzibar must not be ruined." "Why not?" demanded the captain with a look of supreme contempt. "What if Zanzibar was ruined? Look here now, Yoosoof, your dirty little island, the whole island, observe, is not quite the size of my own Scotch county of Lanark. Its population is short of 250,000 all told, scarce equal to the half of the population of Lanark, composed of semi-barbarians and savages. That's one side of the question. Here's the other side. Africa is one of the 4 quarters of the earth, with millions of vigorous niggers and millions of acres of splendid land, and no end of undeveloped resources, and you have the impudence to tell me that an enormous lump of this land must be converted into a desert, and something like 150,000 of its best natives to be drawn off annually. For what? For what?" repeated the sailor, bringing his fist down on the table before him with such force that the glasses danced on it and the dust flew up. "For what, I say? For a paltry, pitiful island, ruled by a sham sultan, without army or navy, and with little money save what he gets by slave trading? An island which has no influence for good on the world, morally, religiously, or socially, and with little commercially, though it has much influence for evil. An island which has helped the Portuguese to lock up the east coast of Africa for centuries. An island which would not be missed, save as a removed curse, if it were to sink this night to the bottom of the sea, and all its selfish, sensual, slave-dealing population swept entirely off the face of the earth." The captain had risen and dashed his pipe to atoms on the floor in his indignation as he made these observations. He now made an effort to control himself, and then, sitting down, he continued: "Just think, Yoosoof. You're a sharp man of business, as I know to my cost. You can understand a thing in a commercial point of view. Just try to look at it thus. On the one side of the world's account you have Zanzibar, sunk with all its Banyan and Arab population. We won't sink the niggers, poor wretches. We'll suppose them saved, along with the consuls, missionaries, and such like. Well, that's a loss of somewhere about 83,000 scoundrels. A gain we might call it, but for the sake of argument we'll call it a loss. On the other side of the account you have 30,000 niggers, fair average specimens of humanity, saved from slavery, besides something like 150,000 more saved from death by war and starvation, the results of the slave trade. 83,000 from 150,000 leaves 67,000. The loss, you see, would be more than wiped off, and a handsome balance left at the world's credit the very first year, to say nothing of the opening up of legitimate commerce to one of the richest countries on earth, and the consequent introduction of Christianity." The captain paused to take a breath. Yoosoof shrugged his shoulders, and a brief silence ensued, which was happily broken, not by a recurrence to the question of slavery, but by the entrance of a slave. He came in search of Yoosoof for the purpose of telling him that his master wished to speak with him. As the slave's master was one of the wealthy Banyans just referred to, Yoosoof rose at once, and apologising to the captain for quitting him so hurriedly, left that worthy son of Neptune to cool his indignation in solitude. Passing through several dirty streets, the slave led the slaver to a better sort of house in a more salubrious, or rather less pestilential part of town. He was ushered into the presence of an elderly man of quiet, unobtrusive aspect. "Yoosoof," said the Banyan in Arabic, "I have been considering the matter about which we had some conversation yesterday, and I find it will be convenient for me to make a small venture. I can let you have $3,000. "On the old terms?" asked Yoosoof. "On the old terms," replied the merchant. "Will you be ready to start soon?" Yoosoof said that he would, that he had already completed the greater part of his preparations, and that he hoped to start for the interior in a week or two. "That is well. I hope you may succeed in doing a good deal of business," said the merchant with an amiable nod and smile, which might have led an ignorant onlooker to imagine that Yoosoof's business in the interior was work of a purely philanthropic nature. "There is another affair which it has struck me may lie in your way," continued the merchant. "The British consul is, I am told, anxious to find some one who will undertake to make inquiries in the interior about some Englishmen, who are said to have been captured by the black fellows and made slaves of." "Does the consul know what tribe has captured them?" asked Yoosoof. "I think not, but as he offers $500 for every lost white man who shall be recovered and brought to the coast alive, I thought that you might wish to aid him." "True," said Yoosoof, musing. True, I will go and see him." Accordingly, the slave trader had an interview with the consul, during which he learned that there was no absolute certainty of any Englishmen having been captured. It was only a vague rumour. Nevertheless, it was sufficiently probable to warrant the offer of $500 to any one who should effect a rescue. Therefore Yoosoof, having occasion to travel into the interior at any rate, undertook to make inquiries. He was also told that two Englishmen had, not long before, purchased an outfit and started off with the intention of proceeding to the interior by way of the Zambesi River, and they, the consul said, might possibly be heard of by him near the regions to which he was bound. But these, he suggested, could not be the men who were reported as missing. Of course Yoosoof had not the most remote idea that these were the very Englishmen whom he himself had captured on the coast, for after parting from them abruptly, as described in a former chapter, he had ceased to care or think about them, and besides was ignorant of the fact that they had been to Zanzibar. Yoosoof's own particular business required a rather imposing outfit. First of all, he purchased and packed about 600 pounds worth of beads of many colours, cloth of different kinds, thick brass wire, and a variety of cheap trinkets, such as black men and women are fond of, for Yoosoof was an honest trader, and paid his way when he found it suitable to do so. He likewise hired 100 men, whom he armed with guns, powder and ball, for Yoosoof was also a dishonest trader, and fought his way when that course seemed most desirable. With this imposing caravan he embarked in a large dhow, sailed for the coast, landed at Kilwa, and proceeded into the interior of Africa. It was a long and toilsome journey over several hundred miles of exceedingly fertile and beautiful country, eminently suited for the happy abode of natives. But Yoosoof and his class who traded in black ivory had depopulated it to such an extent that scarce a human being was to be seen all the way. There were plenty of villages, but they were in ruins, and acres of cultivated ground with the weeds growing rank where the grain had once flourished. Further on in the journey, near the end of it, there was a change. The weeds and grain grew together and did battle, but in most places the weeds gained the victory. It was quite evident that the whole land had once been a rich garden teeming with human life. Savage life, no doubt still, not so savage but that it could manage to exist in comparative enjoyment and multiply. Yoosoof passed through 150 miles of this land. It was a huge grave, which, appropriately enough, was profusely garnished with human bones. Note: see Livingstone's Tributaries of the Zambesi, page 391. End note. At last the slave trader reached lands which were not utterly forsaken. Entering a village one afternoon, he sent a present of cloth and beads to the chief, and after a few preliminary ceremonies, announced that he wished to purchase slaves. The chief, who was a fine looking young warrior, said that he had no men, women, or children to sell, except a few criminals to whom he was welcome at a very low price, about 2 or 3 yards of calico each. There were also 1 or 2 orphan children whose parents had died suddenly, and to whom no one in the village could lay claim. It was true that these poor orphans had been adopted by various families who might not wish to part with them, but no matter, the chief's command was law. Yoosoof might have the orphans also for a very small sum, a yard of calico perhaps. But nothing would induce the chief to compel any of his people to part with their children, and none of the people seemed desirous of doing so. The slave trader therefore adopted another plan. He soon managed to ascertain that the chief had an old grudge against a neighbouring chief. In the course of conversation he artfully stirred up the slumbering ill will, and carefully fanned it into a flame without appearing to have any such end in view. When the iron was sufficiently hot, he struck it, supplied the chief with guns and ammunition, and even, as a great favour, offered to lend him a few of his own men in order that he might make a vigorous attack on his old enemy. The device succeeded to perfection. War was begun without any previous declaration. Prisoners were soon brought in, not only men, but women and children. The first were coupled together with heavy slave sticks which were riveted to their necks. The latter were attached to each other with ropes, and thus Yoosoof in a few days was enabled to proceed on his journey with a goodly drove of black cattle behind him. This occurred not far from Lake Nyassa, which he intended should be his headquarters for a time, while his men, under a new leader whom he expected to meet there, should push their victorious arms further into the interior. On reaching the shores of the noble lake, he found several birds of the same feather with himself, Arabs engaged in the same trade. He also found his old friend and trusty ally, Marizano. This gratified him much, for he was at once enabled to hand over the charge of the expedition to his lieutenant and send him forth on his mission. That same evening, a lovely and comparatively cool one, Yoosoof and the half caste sauntered on the margin of the lake, listening to the sweet melody of the free and happy birds, and watching the debarkation from a large boat of a band of miserable slaves who had been captured or purchased on the other side. "Now, Marizano," said Yoosoof, addressing the half caste in his native tongue, "I do not intend to cumber you with cloth or beads on this expedition. I have already spent a good deal in the purchase of slaves, who are now in my barracoon, and I think it will be both cheaper and easier to make up the rest of the gang by means of powder and lead." "It is lighter to carry, and more effectual," remarked Marizano, with a nod of approval. "True," returned Yoosoof, "and quicker. Will 100 men and guns suffice?" "80 are enough to conquer any of the bow and spear tribes of this region," replied the half caste carelessly. "Good," continued Yoosoof. "Then you shall start to morrow. The tribes beyond this lake are not yet afraid of us, thanks to the mad Englishman, Livingstone, who has opened up the country and spread the information that white men are the friends of the black and hate slavery. Note: Livingstone tells us that he found, on ascending the Shire River, that the Portuguese slave traders had followed closely in the footsteps of his previous discoveries, and passed themselves off as his friends, by which means they were successful in gaining the confidence of the natives, whom they afterwards treacherously murdered or enslaved. You may try to pass yourself off as a white man, though your face is not so white as might be desired. However, you can comfort yourself with the knowledge that it is whiter than your heart." The Arab smiled and glanced at his lieutenant. Marizano smiled, bowed in acknowledgment of the compliment, and replied that he believed himself to be second to no one except his employer in that respect. "Well, then," continued Yoosoof, "you must follow up the discoveries of this Englishman. Give out that you are his friend, and have come there for the same purposes, and when you have put them quite at their ease, commence a brisk trade with them, for which purpose you may take with you just enough of cloth and beads to enable you to carry out the deception. For the rest I need not instruct. You know what to do as well as I." Marizano approved heartily of this plan, and assured his chief that his views should be carried out to his entire satisfaction. "But there is still another point," said Yoosoof, "on which I have to talk. It appears that there are some white men who have been taken prisoners by one of the interior tribes, I know not which, for the finding of whom the British consul at Zanzibar has offered me $500. If you can obtain information about these men it will be well. If you can find and rescue them it will be still better, and you shall have a liberal share of the reward." While the Arab was speaking, the half caste's visage betrayed a slight degree of surprise. "White men," he said, pulling up his sleeve and showing a gunshot wound in his arm which appeared to be not very old. "A white man inflicted that not long ago, and not very far from the spot on which we stand. I had vowed to take the life of that white man if we should ever chance to meet, but if it is worth $500, I may be tempted to spare it." He laughed lightly as he spoke, and then added with a thoughtful look, "But I don't see how these men, there were 2 of them, if not more, can be prisoners, because when I came across them They were well armed, well supplied, and well attended, else you may be sure they had not given me this wound and freed my slaves. But the scoundrels who were with me at the time were cowards." "You are right," said Yoosoof. "The white men you met I heard of at Zanzibar. They cannot be the prisoners we are asked to search for. They have not yet been long enough away, I should think, to have come by any mischance, and the white men who are said to be lost have been talked about in Zanzibar for a long time. However, make diligent inquiries, because the promise is that the $500 shall be ours if we rescue any white man, no matter who he may chance to be. And now I shall show you the cattle I have obtained on the way up." The barracoon to which the Arabs led his lieutenant was a space enclosed by a strong and high stockade, in which slaves were kept under guard until a sufficient number should be secured to form a gang, wherewith to start for the coast. At the entrance stood a savage looking Portuguese half caste armed with a gun. Inside there was an assortment of Yoosoof's black ivory. It was in comparatively good condition at that time, not having travelled far, and, as it was necessary to keep it up to a point of strength sufficient to enable it to reach the coast, it was pretty well fed, except in the case of a few rebellious articles. There were, however, specimens of damaged goods even there. Several of the orphans who had become Yoosoof's property, although sprightly enough when first purchased, had not stood even the short journey to the lake so well as might have been expected. They had fallen off in flesh to such an extent that Yoosoof was induced to remark to Marizano, as they stood surveying them, that he feared they would never reach the coast alive. "That one, now," he said, pointing to a little boy who was tightly wedged in the midst of the group of slaves, and sat on the ground with his face resting on his knees, "is the most troublesome piece of goods I have had to do with since I began business, and it seems to me that I am going to lose him after all." "What's the matter with him?" asked the half caste. "Nothing particular, only he is a delicate boy. At first I refused him, but he is so well made, though delicate, and such a good looking child, and so spirited, that I decided to take him, but he turns out to be too spirited. Nothing that I can do will tame him." "Oh, that won't do it," said Yoosoof, observing that Marizano raised the switch he carried in his hand with a significant action. "I have beaten him till there is scarcely a sound inch of skin on his whole body, but it's of no use. Ho! Stand up!" called Yoosoof, letting the lash of his whip fall lightly on the boy's shoulders. There was, however, no response. The Arab, therefore, repeated the order, and laid the lash across the child's bare back with a degree of force that would have caused the stoutest man to wince. Still the boy did not move. Somewhat surprised, Yoosoof pushed his way towards him, seized him by the hair, and threw back his head. The Arab left him immediately, and remarked in a quiet tone that he should have no more trouble with him. He was dead. "What's the matter with that fellow?" asked Marizano, pointing to a man who was employed in constantly rolling up a bit of wet clay and applying it to his left eye. "Ah, he's another one of these unmanageable fellows," replied Yoosoof. "I have been trying to tame him by starvation. The other morning he fell on his knees before the man who guards the barracoon, and entreated him to give him food. The guard is a rough fellow, and had been put out of temper lately by a good many of the slaves. Instead of giving him food, he gave him a blow in the eye which burst the ball of it, and of course has rendered him worthless. But he won't trouble us long." In another place a woman crouched on the ground, having something wrapped in leaves which she pressed to her dried breast. It was the body of a child to which she had recently given birth in that place of woe. Leaving his cringing and terrified goods to the guardian of the barracoon, the Arab returned to his tent beside the beautiful lake, and there, while enjoying the aroma of flowers and the cool breeze, and the genial sunshine, and the pleasant influences which God has scattered with bountiful hand over that luxuriant portion of the earth, calmly concerted with Marizano the best method by which he could bring inconceivable misery on thousands of its wretched inhabitants. Chapter 18. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 19 of Black Ivory by R. M. Ballantyne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19 tells of misfortunes that befell our wanderers, of familiar toys under new aspects, etc., etc. When Harold Seadrift and Disco Lillihammer were stopped in their journey, as related in a former chapter, by the sudden illness of the bold seaman, an event was impending over them which effectually overturned their plans. This was the sudden descent of a band of armed natives who had been recently driven from their homes by a slaving party. The slavers had taken them by surprise during the night, set their huts on fire, captured their women and children, and slaughtered all the men, excepting those who sought and found safety in flight. It was those who had thus escaped that chanced to come upon the camp of our travellers one evening about sunset. Disco was recovering from his attack of fever at the time, though still weak. Harold was sitting by his couch of leaves in the hut which had been erected for him on the first day of the illness. Jumbo was cutting up a piece of flesh for supper, and Antonio was putting the kettle on the fire. The rest of the party were away in the woods hunting. No guard was kept. Consequently, the savages came down on them like a thunderbolt, and found them quite unprepared to resist, even if resistance had been of any use. At first their captors, bitterly infuriated by their recent losses, proposed to kill their prisoners, without delay, by means of the most excruciating tortures that they could invent, but for some unknown cause changed their minds, coupled Harold and Disco together by means of 2 slave sticks, tied Antonio and Jumbo with ropes, and drove them away. So suddenly was the thing done, and so effectually, that Disco was far from the camp before he could realise that what had occurred was a fact, and not one of the wild, feverish dreams that had beset him during his illness. The natives would not listen to the earnest explanation of Antonio that Harold and Disco were Englishmen, and haters of slavery. They scowled as they replied that the same had been said by the slavers who had attacked their village, from which remark it would seem that Yoosoof was not quite the originator of that device to throw the natives off their guard. The Portuguese of Tette, on the Zambesi, had also thought of and acted on it. Fortunately it was, as we have said, near sunset when the capture was made, and before it became quite dark the band encamped, else must poor Disco have succumbed to weakness and fatigue. The very desperation of his circumstances, however, seemed to revive his strength, for next morning he resumed his journey with some hope of being able to hold out. The continued protestations and assurances of Antonio, also, had the effect of inducing their captors to remove the heavy slave sticks from the necks of Harold and Disco, though they did not unbind their wrists. Thus were they led further into the country, they knew not whither, for several days and nights, and at last reached a large village where they were all thrust into a hut, and left to their meditations, while their captors went to palaver with the chief man of the place. This chief proved to be a further sighted man than the men of the tribe who had captured the Englishmen. His name was Yambo. He had heard of Dr Livingstone, and had met with men of other tribes who had seen and conversed with the great traveller. Thus, being of a thoughtful and inquiring disposition, he had come to understand enough of the good white man's sentiments to guard him from being imposed on by pretended Christians. Yambo's name signified "How are you?" and was probably bestowed on him because of a strongly benevolent tendency to greet friend and stranger alike with a hearty "How d'ye do?" sort of expression of face and tone of voice. He was a tall, grave man, with a commanding, firm look, and withal a dash of childlike humour and simplicity. On hearing his visitors' remarks about their captives, he at once paid them a visit, and a few leading questions put to Harold through Antonio convinced him that the prisoners were true men. He therefore returned to his black visitors, told them that he had perfect confidence in the good faith of the white men, and said that he meant to take charge of them. He then entertained his black brothers hospitably, gave them a few presents, and sent them on their way. This done, he returned to his guests and told them that they were free, that their captors were gone, and that they might go where they pleased, but that it would gratify him much if they would consent to spend some time hunting with him in the neighbourhood of his village. "Now," said Disco after Yambo left them, "this is wot I call the most uncommon fix that ever was got into by man since Adam and Eve began housekeepin' in the Garden of Eden." "I'm not quite sure," replied Harold with a rueful look, "that it is absolutely the worst fix, but it is bad enough. The worst of it is that this Yambo has let these rascals off with all our firearms and camp equipage, so that we are absolutely helpless might as well be prisoners, for we can't quit this village in such circumstances. What's wuss than that to my mind, sir, is that here we are at sea, in the heart of Afriky, without chart, quadrant, compass, or rudder, and no more idea of our whereabouts than one o' them spider monkeys that grins among the trees. Hows'ever, we're in luck to fall into the hands of a friendly chief, so, like these same monkeys, we must grin and bear it, only I can't help feelin' a bit downcast at the loss of our messmates. I fear there's no chance of their findin' us." "Not the least chance in the world, I should say," returned Harold. "They could not guess in which direction we had gone, and unless they had hit on the right road at first, every step they took afterwards would only widen the distance between us." "It's lucky I was beginnin' to mend before we was catched," said Disco, feeling the muscles of his legs. "True, I ain't much to boast of yet, but I'm improvin'." "That is more than I can say for myself," returned Harold with a sigh, as he passed his hand across his forehead. "I feel as if this last push through the woods in the hot sun, and the weight of that terrible slave stick, had been almost too much for me." Disco looked earnestly and anxiously into the face of his friend. "What," asked he, "does you feel?" "I can scarcely tell," replied Harold with a faint smile. "Oh, I suppose I'm a little knocked up, that's all. A night's rest will put me all right." "So I thought myself, but I was wrong," said Disco. "Let's hear what your feelin's is, sir. I'm as good as any doctor now, I am, in regard to symptoms." "Well, I feel a sort of all overishness, a kind of lassitude and sleepiness, with a slight headache, and a dull pain which appears to be creeping up my spine." "You're in for it, sir," said Disco. "It's lucky you have always carried the physic in your pockets, 'cause you'll need it, and it's lucky, too, that I'm here and well enough to return tit for tat and nurse you, 'cause you'll have that 'ere pain in your spine creep up your back and around your ribs till it lays hold of your shoulders, where it'll stick as if it had made up its mind to stay there for ever and a day. Arter that you'll get cold and shiverin' like ice oh, doesn't I know it well and then hot as fire, with heavy head, and swimmin' eyes, and twisted sight, and confusion of " "Hold! hold!" cried Harold, laughing. "If you go on in that way I shall have more than my fair share of it. Pray stop and leave me a little to find out for myself." "Well, sir, take a purge, and turn in at once, that's my advice. I'll dose you with quinine to morrow mornin', first thing," said Disco, rising and proceeding forthwith to arrange a couch in a corner of the hut which Yambo had assigned them. Harold knew well enough that his follower was right. He took his advice without delay, and next morning found himself little better than a child, both physically and mentally, for the disease not only prostrated his great strength, as it had that of his equally robust companion, but at a certain stage induced delirium, during which he talked the most ineffable nonsense that his tongue could pronounce, or his brain conceive. Poor Disco, who, of course, had been unable to appreciate the extent of his own delirious condition, began to fear that his leader's mind was gone for ever, and Jumbo was so depressed by the unutterably solemn expression of the mariner's once jovial countenance, that he did not once show his teeth for a whole week, save when engaged with meals. As for Antonio, his nature not being very sympathetic, and his health being good, he rather enjoyed the quiet life and good living which characterised the native village, and secretly hoped that Harold might remain on the sick list for a considerable time to come. How long this state of affairs lasted we cannot tell, for both Harold and Disco lost the correct record of time during their respective illnesses. Up to that period they had remembered the days of the week, in consequence of their habit of refraining from going out to hunt on Sundays, except when a dearth of meat in the larder rendered hunting a necessity. Upon these Sundays Harold's conscience sometimes reproached him for having set out on his journey into Africa without a Bible. He whispered, to himself at first, and afterwards suggested to Disco the excuse that his Bible had been lost in the wreck of his father's vessel, and that perhaps there were no Bibles to be purchased in Zanzibar, but his conscience was a troublesome one, and refused to tolerate such bad reasoning, reminding him reproachfully that he had made no effort whatever to obtain a Bible at Zanzibar. As time had passed and some of the horrors of the slave trade had been brought under his notice, many of the words of Scripture leaped to his remembrance, and the regret that he had not carried a copy with him increased. That touch of thoughtlessness, so natural to the young and healthy, to whom life has so far been only a garden of roses, was utterly routed by the stern and dreadful realities which had been recently enacted around him, and just in proportion as he was impressed with the lies, tyranny, cruelty, and falsehood of man, so did his thoughtful regard for the truth and the love of God increase, especially those truths that were most directly opposed to the traffic in human flesh, such as "Love your enemies," "Seek peace with all men," "Be kindly affectioned one to another," "Whatsoever ye would that men should do unto you, do ye even so to them." An absolute infidel, he thought, could not fail to perceive that a most blessed change would come over the face of Africa if such principles prevailed among its inhabitants, even in an extremely moderate degree. But to return. The unfortunate travellers were now at sea altogether in regard to the Sabbath as well as the day of the month. Indeed, their minds were not very clear as to the month itself. "Hows'ever," said Disco, when this subject afterwards came to be discussed, "it don't matter much. What is it that the Scriptur' says? '6 days shalt thou labour, and do all that thou hast to do, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt do no work.' I was used always to stick at that pint w'en my poor mother was a teachin' of me. Never got past it, but it's enough for present use anyhow, for the orders is, work 6 days, and don't work the seventh. Werry good, we'll begin to day, and call it Monday. We'll work for 6 days, and when the seventh day comes we'll call it Sunday. If it ain't the right day, we can't help it. Moreover, wot's the odds? It's the seventh day, so that to us it'll be the Sabbath." But we anticipate. Harold was still, at the beginning of this digression, in the delirium of fever, though there were symptoms of improvement about him. One afternoon one of these symptoms was strongly manifested in a long profound slumber. While he slept, Disco sat on a low stool beside him, busily engaged with a clasp knife on some species of manufacture, the nature of which was not apparent at a glance. His admirer, Jumbo, was seated on a stool opposite, gazing at him open mouthed, with a countenance that reflected every passing feeling of his dusky bosom. Both men were so deeply absorbed in their occupation, Disco in his manufacture, and Jumbo in staring at Disco, that they failed for a considerable time to observe that Harold had wakened suddenly, though quietly, and was gazing at them with a look of lazy, easy going surprise. The mariner kept up a running commentary on his work, addressed to Jumbo indeed, but in a quiet interjectional manner that seemed to imply that he was merely soliloquising, and did not want or expect a reply. "It's the most 'stror'nary notion, Jumbo, between you and me and the post, that I ever did see. Now then, this here bullet head wants a pair of eyes and a nose on it. The mouth'll do, but it's the mouth as is most troublesome, for you niggers have got such wapping muzzles. It's quite a caution, as the Yankees say." A pause. "On the whole. However, the nose is very difficult to manage on a flat surface, 'cause why? If I leaves it quite flat, it don't look like a nose, and if I carves it out ever so little, it's too prominent for a nigger nose. There, ain't that a good head, Jumbo?" Thus directly appealed to, Jumbo nodded his own head violently, and showed his magnificent teeth from ear to ear, gums included. Disco laid down the flat piece of board which he had carved into the form of a human head, and took up another piece which was rudely blocked out into the form of a human leg, both leg and head being as large as life. Now, this limb, Jumbo," continued Disco, slowly, as he whittled away with the clasp knife vigorously, "is much more troublesome than I would have expected, for you niggers have got such an abdominally ill-shaped legs below the knee. There's no such unnat'ral bend for'ard of the shin bone, and such a ridikerlous stickin' out of the heel astarn, d'ye see, that a feller with white man notions has to make a study of it, if he sets up for an artist. In course, if he don't set up for an artist any sort o' shape'll do, for it don't affect the jumpin'. Ha! there they go!" he exclaimed, with a humorous smile at the hearty shout of laughter which was heard just outside the hut. "Enjoyin' the old 'un, but it's nothin' to wot the new 'un'll be w'en it's finished." At this exhibition of amusement on the countenance of his friend, Jumbo threw back his head, and again showed not only his teeth and gums, but the entire inside of his mouth, and chuckled softly from the region of his breastbone. "I'm dreaming, of course," thought Harold, and shut his eyes. Poor fellow, he was very weak, and the mere act of shutting his eyes induced a half slumber. He awoke again in a few minutes, and reopening his eyes beheld the two men still sitting and occupied as before. "It is a wonderfully pertinacious dream," thought Harold. "I'll try to dissipate it." Thinking thus, he called out aloud, "I say, Disco!" "Hallo! that's uncommon like the old tones," exclaimed the seaman, dropping his knife and the leg of wood as he looked anxiously at his friend. "What old tones?" asked Harold. "The tones of your voice," said Disco. "Have they changed so much of late?" inquired Harold in surprise. "Have they? I should think they have, just. Why, you haven't spoke like that, sir, for but surely, are you better, and is this only another dodge o' your madness?" asked Disco with a troubled look. "I suppose I've been delirious, have I?" said Harold with a faint smile. To this Disco replied that he had not only been delirious, but stark staring mad, and expressed a very earnest hope that, now he had got his senses hauled taut again, he'd belay them and make all fast, for, if he didn't, it was his, Disco's opinion, that another breeze of the same kind would blow 'em all to ribbons. "Moreover," continued Disco firmly, "you're not to talk. I once nursed a messmate through a fever, and I remember that the doctor was werry particular, when he began to come round, in orderin' him to hold his tongue and keep quiet." "You are right, Disco. I will keep quiet, but you must first tell me what you are about, for it has aroused my curiosity, and I can't rest till I know." "Well, sir, I'll tell you, but don't go for to make no obsarvations on it. Just keep your mouth shut and your ears open, and I'll do all the jawin'. Well, you must know, soon after you was took bad, I felt as if I'd like some sort o' occupation, when sittin' here watchin' of you. Jumbo and me's been takin' the watch time about, for Antony isn't able to hold a boy, much less you when you gets obstropolous. Well, sir, I had took a sort o' fancy for Yambo's youngest boy, for he's a fine, brave little shaver, he is, and I thought I'd make him some sort o' toy, and it struck me that the thing as 'ud please him most 'ud be a jumpin' jack, so I set to and made him one about a foot high. You never seen such a face o' joy as that youngster put on, sir, when I took it to him and pulled the string. He gave a little squeak o' delight, he did, took it in his hands, and ran home to show it to his mother. Well, sir, what d'ye think, the poor boy came back soon after, blubberin' and sobbin' as nat'ral as if he'd bin an English boy, and he says to Tony, says he, `Father's bin and took it away from me.' I was surprised at this, and went right off to see about it, and when I come to Yambo's hut, what does I see but the chief pullin' the string of the jumpin' jack, and grinnin' and sniggerin' like a blue faced baboon in a passion, his wife likewise standin' by, holdin' her sides with laughin'. Well, sir, the moment I goes in, up gets the chief and shouts for Tony, and tells him to tell me that I must make him a jumpin' jack. In course I says I'd do it with all the pleasure in life, and he says that I must make it full size, as big as hisself. I opened my eyes at this, but he said he must have a thing that was fit for a man, a chief, so there was nothin' for it but to set to work. And it weren't difficult to manage neither, for they supplied me with slabs of timber an inch thick, and I soon blocked out the body and limbs with a hatchet, and polished 'em off with my knife, and then put 'em together. When the big jack was all right Yambo took it away, for he'd watched me all the time I was at it, and fixed it up to the branch of a tree and set to work. I never did," continued Disco, slapping his right thigh, while Jumbo grinned in sympathy, "see sich a big baby as Yambo became when he got that monstrous jumpin' jack into action, with his courtiers all around him, their faces blazin' with surprise and conwulsed with laughter. The chief hisself was too hard at work to laugh much. He could only glare and grin, for big and strong though he is, the jack was so awful heavy that it took all his weight in muscle haulin' on the rope which occupied the place o' the string that we're used to. Haul away, my hearty, thought I, when I seed him heavin', blowin', and sweatin' at the jack's halyards, you'll not break that rope in a hurry. But I was wrong, sir, for although the halyards held on all right, I had not calculated on such wiolent action at the joints. All of a sudden, off comes a leg at the knee. It was goin' the up'ard kick at the time, and went up like a rocket, slap through a troop o' monkeys that was a lookin' on aloft, which had scattered like foam in a gale. Yambo didn't seem to care a pinch o' snuff. His blood was up. The sweat was runnin' off him like rain. "Hi!" cries he, givin' another most awful tug. But it wasn't hi that time, for the other leg came off at the hip joint on the down kick and went straight into the bosom of a black warrior and floored him worse than he ever was floored since he took to fightin'. Yambo didn't care for that either. He gave another haul with all his might, which proved too much for Jack without his legs, for it threw his arms out with such force that they jammed hard and fast, as if the poor critter was howlin' for mercy. Yambo looked awful blank at this. Then he turned sharp round and looked at me for all the world as if he meant to say, "What d'ee mean by that, eh?" "He shouldn't ought to lick into him like that," says I to Tony. "The figure ain't made to be druv by a 6 horsepower steam engine. But tell him I'll fix it up with jints that'll stand pullin' by an elephant, and I'll make him another jack to the full as big as that one and twice as strong. This," added Disco in conclusion, taking up the head on which he had been engaged, "is the noo jack. The old un's outside workin' away at this moment like a windmill. Listen, don't 'ee hear 'em?" Harold listened and found no difficulty in hearing them, for peals of laughter and shrieks of delight burst forth every few minutes, apparently from a vast crowd outside the hut. "I do believe," said Disco, rising and going towards the door of the hut, "that you can see 'em from where you lay." He drew aside the skin doorway as he spoke, and there, sure enough, was the gigantic jumping jack hanging from the limb of a tree, clearly defined against the sky, and galvanically kicking about its vast limbs, with Yambo pulling fiercely at the tail, and the entire tribe looking on steeped in ecstasy and admiration. It may easily be believed that the sight of this, coupled with Disco's narrative, was almost too much for Harold's nerves, and for some time he exhibited, to Disco's horror, a tendency to repeat some antics which would have been much more appropriate to the jumping jack, but after a warm drink administered by his faithful though rough nurse, he became composed, and finally dropped into a pleasant sleep, which was not broken till late the following morning. Refreshed in body, happy in mind, and thankful in spirit, he rose to feel that the illness against which he had fought for many days was conquered, and that, although still very weak, he had fairly turned the corner, and had begun to regain some of his wonted health and vigour. Chapter 19. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom's Audiobooks.com. Chapter 20 of Black Ivory by R.M. Ballantyne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20. Harold appears in a new character, and two old characters reappear to Harold. The mind of Yambo was a strange compound, a curious mixture of gravity and rollicking joviality, at one time displaying a phase of intense solemnity, at another exhibiting quiet pleasantry and humour, but earnestness was the prevailing trait of his character. Whether indulging his passionate fondness for the jumping jack, or engaged in guiding the deliberations of his councillors, the earnest chief was equally devoted to the work in hand. Being a savage, and consequently led entirely by feeling, which is perhaps the chief characteristic of savage, as distinguished from civilized man. He hated his enemies with exceeding bitterness, and loved his friends with all his heart. Yambo was very tender to Harold during his illness, and the latter felt corresponding gratitude, so that there sprang up between the two a closer friendship than one could have supposed to be possible, considering that they were so different from each other, mentally, physically, and socially, and that their only mode of exchanging ideas was through the medium of a very incompetent interpreter. Among other things, Harold discovered that his friend the chief was extremely fond of anecdotes and stories. He, therefore, while in a convalescent state, and unable for much physical exercise, amused himself and spent much of his time in narrating to him the adventures of Robinson Crusoe. Yambo's appetite for mental food increased, and when Crusoe's tale was finished he eagerly demanded more. Some of his warriors also came to hear, and at last the hut was unable to contain the audiences that wished to enter. Harold therefore removed to an open space under a banyan tree, and there daily for several hours related all the tales and narratives with which he was acquainted, to the hundreds of open-eyed and open-mouthed negroes who squatted around him. At first he selected such tales as he thought would be likely to amuse, but these being somewhat soon exhausted, he told them about anything that chanced to recur to his memory. Then, finding that their power to swallow the marvellous was somewhat crocodilish, he gave them Jack the Giant Killer, and Jack of Beanstalk notoriety, and Tom Thumb, Cinderella, etc., until his entire nursery stock was exhausted, after which he fell back on his inventive powers. But the labour of this last effort proving very considerable, and the results not being adequately great, he took to history, and told them stories about William Tell, and Wallace, and Bruce, and the Puritans of England, and the Scottish Covenanters, and the discoveries of Columbus, until the eyes and mouths of his black auditors were held so constantly and widely on the stretch, that Disco began to fear they would become gradually incapable of being shut, and he entertained a fear that poor Antonio's tongue would, ere long, be dried up at the roots. At last a thought occurred to our hero, which he promulgated to Disco one morning as they were seated at breakfast on the floor of their hut. "It seems to me, Disco," he said after a prolonged silence, during which they had been busily engaged with their knives and wooden spoons, "that illness must be sent sometimes to teach men that they give too little of their thoughts to the future world." "Werry true, sir," replied Disco, in that quiet, matter-of-course tone with which men generally receive axiomatic verities. "We is raither to give and swallered up with this world, which ain't surprisin' neither, seein' that we've been put into it, and are surrounded by it, mixed up with it, steeped in it, so to speak, and can't werry well help ourselves." "That last is just the point I'm not quite so sure about," rejoined Harold. "Since I've been lying ill here I have thought a good deal about forgetting to bring a Bible with me, and about the meaning of the term Christian, which name I bear. And yet I can't, when I look honestly at it, see that I do much to deserve the name." "Well, I don't quite see that, sir," said Disco, with an argumentative curl of his right eyebrow. "You doesn't swear, or drink, or steal, or commit murder, and a many other things of that sort. Ain't that the result of your bein' a Christian?" "It may be so, Disco, but that is only what may be styled the don't side of the question. What troubles me is that I don't see much on the do side of it." "You says your prayers, sir, don't you?" asked Disco, with the air of a man who had put a telling question. "Well, yes," replied Harold, "but what troubles me is that, while in my creed I profess to think the salvation of souls is of such vital importance, in my practice I seem to say that it is of no importance at all. For here have I been for many weeks amongst these black fellows, and have never so much as mentioned the name of our Saviour to them, although I have been telling them no end of stories of all kinds, both true and fanciful." "There's somethin' in that, sir," admitted Disco. Harold also thought there was so much in it that he gave the subject a great deal of earnest consideration, and finally resolved to begin to tell the negroes Bible stories. He was thus gradually led to tell them that old story of God the Saviour's life and death, and love for man, which he found interested, affected, and influenced the savages far more powerfully than any of the tales, whether true or fanciful, with which he had previously entertained them. While doing this a new spirit seemed to actuate himself, and to influence his whole being. While Harold was thus led almost unconsciously to become a sower of the blessed seed of God's word, Marizano was working his way through the country, setting forth in the most extreme manner the ultimate results of man's sinful nature and the devil's lies. One of his first deeds was to visit a village which was beautifully situated on the banks of a small but deep river. In order to avoid alarming the inhabitants, he approached it with only about 30 of his men, 20 of whom were armed. Arrived at the outskirts, he halted his armed men and advanced with the other 10, calling out cheerfully, "We have things for sale. Have you anything to sell?" The chief and his warriors, armed with their bows and arrows and shields, met him, and forbade him to pass within the hedge that encircled the village, but told him to sit down under a tree outside. A mat of split reeds was placed for Marizano to sit on, and when he had explained to the chief that the object of his visit was to trade with him for ivory, in proof of which he pointed to the bales which his men carried, he was well received and a great clapping of hands ensued. Presents were then exchanged and more clapping of hands took place, for this was considered the appropriate ceremony. The chief and his warriors, on sitting down before Marizano and his men, clapped their hands together and continued slapping on their thighs while handing their presents or when receiving those of their visitors. It was the African "thank you." To have omitted it would have been considered very bad manners. Soon a brisk trade was commenced, in which the entire community became ere long deeply and eagerly absorbed. Meanwhile, Marizano's armed men were allowed to come forward. The women prepared food for the strangers, and after they had eaten and drunk of the native beer heartily, Marizano asked the chief if he had ever seen firearms used. "Yes," replied the chief, "but only once at a great distance off. It is told to me that your guns kill very far off, much further than our bows. Is this so?" "It is true," replied Marizano, who was very merry by this time under the influence of the beer, as, indeed, were also his men and their entertainers. "Would you like to see what our guns can do?" asked the half caste. "If you will permit me, I shall let you hear and see them in use." The unsuspecting chief at once gave his consent. His visitors rose, Marizano gave the word, a volley was poured forth which instantly killed the chief and 20 of his men. The survivors fled in horror. The young women and children were seized, the village was sacked, which means that the old and useless members of the community were murdered in cold blood, and the place was set on fire, and Marizano marched away with his band of captives considerably augmented, leaving a scene of death and horrible desolation behind him. Note. See Livingstone's Zambesi and its Tributaries, pages 201 and 202. End of note. Thus did that villain walk through the land with fire and sword, procuring slaves for the supply of the domestic institution of the Sultan of Zanzibar. By degrees the murderer's drove of black cattle increased to such an extent that when he approached the neighbourhood of the village in which Harold and Disco sojourned, he began to think that he had obtained about as many as he could conveniently manage, and meditated turning his face eastward, little dreaming how near he was to $1,000 worth of property, in the shape of ransom for 2 white men. He was on the point of turning back and missing this when he chanced to fall in with a villager who was out hunting, and who, after a hot chase, was captured. This man was made much of, and presented with some yards of cloth as well as a few beads, at the same time being assured that he had nothing to fear, that the party was merely a slave trading one, that the number of slaves required had been made up, but that a few more would be purchased if the chief of his village had any to dispose of. On learning from the man that his village was a large one, fully 2 days' march from the spot where he stood, and filled with armed men, Marizano came to the conclusion that it would not be worth his while to proceed thither, and was about to order his informant to be added to his gang with a slave stick round his neck, when he suddenly bethought him of inquiring as to whether any white men had been seen in these parts. As he had often made the same inquiry before without obtaining any satisfactory answer, it was with great surprise that he now heard from his captive of two white men being in the very village about which he had been conversing. At once he changed his plan, resumed his march, and a couple of days afterwards presented himself before the astonished eyes of Harold Seadrift and Disco Lillihammer, while they were taking a walk about a mile from the village. Disco recognised the slave trader at once, and from the troubled as well as surprised look of Marizano, it was pretty evident that he remembered the countenance of Disco. When the recollection of Marizano's cruelty at the time of their first meeting flashed upon him, Disco felt an almost irresistible desire to rush upon and strangle the Portuguese, but the calm deportment of that wily man and the peaceful manner in which he had approached partly disarmed his wrath. He could not, however, quite restrain his tongue. "Ha!" said he, "you are the blackguard that we met and pretty nigh shot when we first came to these parts, eh? Pity we missed you, you black-hearted villain!" As Marizano did not understand English, these complimentary remarks were lost on him. He seemed, however, to comprehend the drift of them, for he returned Disco's frown with a stare of defiance. "Whatever he was, or whatever he is," interposed Harold, "we must restrain ourselves just now, Disco, because we cannot punish him as he deserves, however much we may wish to, and he seems to have armed men enough to put us and our entertainers completely in his power. Keep quiet while I speak to him." Jumbo and Antonio, armed with bows and arrows, for they were in search of small game wherewith to supply the pot, came up looking very much surprised, and the latter a good deal frightened. "Ask him, Antonio," said Harold, "what is his object in visiting this part of the country." "To procure slaves," said Marizano, curtly. "I thought so," returned Harold, "but he will find that the men of this tribe are not easily overcome." "I do not wish to overcome them," said the half caste. "I have procured enough of slaves, as you see," pointing to the gang which was halted some 100 yards or so in rear of his armed men, "but I have heard that you were prisoners here, and I have come to prove to you that even a slave trader can return good for evil. You did this," he said, looking at Disco, and pointing to his old wound in the arm. "I now come to deliver you from slavery." Having suppressed part of the truth and supplemented the rest of it with this magnificent lie, Marizano endeavoured to look magnanimous. "I don't believe a word of it," said Disco, decidedly. "I incline to doubt it too," said Harold, "but he may have some good reason of his own for his friendly professions towards us. In any case, we have no resource left but to assume that he speaks the truth." Turning to Marizano, he said, "We are not prisoners here. We are guests of the chief of this village." "In that case," replied the half caste, "I can return to the coast without you." As he said this, a large band of the villagers, having discovered that strangers had arrived, drew near. Marizano at once advanced, making peaceful demonstrations, and after the requisite amount of clapping of hands on both sides, stated the object for which he had come. He made no attempt to conceal the fact that he was a slave trader, but said that, having purchased enough of slaves, he had visited their village because of certain rumours to the effect that some white men had been lost in these regions, and could not find their way back to the coast. He was anxious, he said, to help these white men to do so, but finding that the white men then at the village were not the men he was in search of, and did not want to go to the coast, he would just stay long enough with the chief to exchange compliments, and then depart. All this was translated to the white men in question by their faithful ally Antonio, and when they retired to consult as to what should be done, they looked at each other with half amused and half perplexed expressions of countenance. "Werry odd," said Disco, "how contrary things turns up at times." "Very odd indeed," assented Harold, laughing. "It is quite true that we are, in one sense, lost and utterly unable to undertake a journey through this country without men, means, or arms, and nothing could be more fortunate than that we should have the chance, thus suddenly thrown in our way, of travelling under the escort of a band of armed men. Nevertheless, I cannot bear the idea of travelling with or being indebted to a slave trader and a scoundrel like Marizano." "That's where it is, sir," said Disco with emphasis. "I could stand anything almost but that." "And yet," pursued Harold, "it is our only chance. I see quite well that we may remain for years here without again having such an opportunity, or such an escort thrown in our way." "There's no help for it, I fear," said Disco. "We must take it like a dose o' nasty physic, hold our nobs, shut our daylights, and down with it. The only thing I ain't sure of is your ability to travel. You ain't strong yet." "Oh, I'm strong enough now, or very nearly so, and getting stronger every day. Well, then, I suppose it's settled that we go?" "Humph! I'm agreeable, and the whole business very disagreeable," said Disco, making a wry face. Marizano was much pleased when the decision of the white men was made known to him, and the native chief was naturally much distressed, for not only was he about to lose two men of whom he had become very fond, but he was on the point of being bereft of his story teller, the opener up of his mind, the man who, above all others, had taught him to think about his Maker and a future state. He had sense enough, however, to perceive that his guests could not choose but avail themselves of so good an opportunity, and after the first feeling of regret was over, made up his mind to the separation. Next day Harold and Disco, with feelings of strong revulsion, almost of shame, fell into the ranks of the slave gang, and for many days thereafter marched through the land in company with Marizano and his band of lawless villains. Marizano usually walked some distance ahead of the main body with a few trusty comrades. Our adventurers, with their two followers, came next in order of march, the gang of slaves in single file followed, and the armed men brought up the rear. It was necessarily a very long line, and at a distance resembled some hideous reptile crawling slowly and tortuously through the fair fields and plains of Africa. At first there were no stragglers, for the slaves were as yet, with few exceptions, strong and vigorous. These exceptions and the lazy were easily kept in line by means of rope and chain, as well as the rod and lash. Harold and Disco studiously avoided their leader during the march. Marizano fell in with their humour and left them to themselves. At nights they made their own fire and cooked their own supper, as far removed from the slave camp as was consistent with safety, for they could not bear to witness the sufferings of the slaves or to look upon their captors. Even the food that they were constrained to eat appeared to have a tendency to choke them, and altogether the situation became so terrible that they several times almost formed the desperate resolution of leaving the party and trying to reach the coast by themselves as they best might, but the utter madness and hopelessness of such a project soon forced itself on their minds and ensured its being finally abandoned. One morning Marizano threw off his usual reserve, and approaching the white men told them that in 2 hours they would reach the lake where his employer was encamped. "And who is your master?" asked Harold. "A black faced or yellow faced blackguard like himself, I doubt not," growled Disco. Antonio put Harold's question without Disco's comment, and Marizano replied that his master was an Arab trader, and added that he would push on in advance of the party and inform him of their approach. Soon afterwards the lake was reached. A large dhow was in readiness, the gang was embarked and ferried across to a place where several rude buildings and barracoons, with a few tents, indicated that it was one of the inland headquarters of the trade in Black Ivory. The moment our travellers landed, Marizano led them to one of the nearest buildings and introduced them to his master. "Yoosoof!" exclaimed Disco in a shout of astonishment. It would have been a difficult question to have decided which of the three faces displayed the most extreme surprise. Perhaps Disco's would have been awarded the palm, but Yoosoof was undoubtedly the first to regain his self possession. "You be surprised," he said in his very broken English, while his pale yellow visage resumed its placid gravity of expression. "Undoubtedly we are," said Harold. "Bustin'!" exclaimed Disco. "You would not be so much surprised did you know dat I comes to here every year, and dat English consul ask me for 'quire about you?" "If that be so, how comes it that you were surprised to see us?" asked Harold. "'Cause why? I only knows dat some white mans be lost theirselves, not knows what mans, not knows it was you." "Well, now," cried Disco, unable to restrain himself as he turned to Harold, did ever two unfortunates meet with sich luck. Here have we been obliged for days to keep company with the greatest Portuguese villain in the country, and now we're necessitated to be under an obligation to the greatest Arab scoundrel in Afriky." The scoundrel in question smiled and shrugged his shoulders. "Yoosoof," cried Disco, clenching his fist and looking full in the trader's eyes, "when I last saw your ugly face, I vowed that if ever I seed it again I'd leave my mark on it pretty deep, I did, and now I does see it again, but I haven't the moral courage to touch such a poor, pitiful, shrivelled up package of bones and half tanned leather. Moreover, I'm goin' to be indebted to 'ee. Ha, ha!" He laughed bitterly, and with a dash of wild humour in the tone, "to travel under your care, and eat your accursed bread, and oh! there ain't no sich thing as shame left in my corpus. I'm a low, mean spirited, boastful idiot, that's what I am, and I don't care the fag end of a hunk o' gingerbread who knows it." After this explosion, the sorely tried mariner brought his right hand down on his thigh with a tremendous crack, turned about, and walked away to cool himself. Chapter 20. Recording by Tom Weiss, Audiobooks.com. Chapter 21. A Black Ivory, by R.M. Ballantyne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21. Progress of the Slave Run, the Deadly Swamp, and the Unexpected Rescue. We will now leap over a short period of time, about 2 or 3 weeks, during which the sable procession had been winding its weary way over hill and dale, plain and swamp. During that comparatively brief period, Harold and Disco had seen so much cruelty and suffering that they both felt a strange tendency to believe that the whole must be the wild imaginings of a horrible dream. Perhaps weakness, resulting from illness, might have had something to do with this peculiar feeling of unbelief, for both had been subject to a second, though slight, attack of fever. Nevertheless, coupled with their scepticism with a contradictory and dreadful certainty that they were not dreaming, but that what they witnessed was absolute verity. It is probable that if they had been in their ordinary health and vigour, they would have made a violent attempt to rescue the slaves, even at the cost of their own lives. But severe and prolonged illness often unhinges the mind as well as the body, and renders the spirit all but impotent. One sultry evening the sad procession came to a long stretch of swamp, and prepared to cross it. Although already thinned by death, the slave gang was large. It numbered several hundreds, and was led by Marizano, Yoosoof having started some days in advance in charge of a similar gang. Harold and Disco were by that time in the habit of walking together in front of the gang, chiefly for the purpose of avoiding the sight of cruelties and woes which they were powerless to prevent or assuage. On reaching the edge of the swamp, however, they felt so utterly wearied and dispirited that they sat down on a bank to rest, intending to let the slave gang go into the swamp before them and then follow in rear. Antonio and Jumbo also remained with them. "You should go on in front," said Marizano significantly, on observing their intention. "Tell him we'll remain where we are," said Disco sternly to Antonio. Marizano shrugged his shoulders and left them. The leading men of the slave gang were ordered to advance, as soon as the armed guard had commenced the toilsome march over ground into which they sank knee deep at every step. The first man of the gang hesitated, and heaved a deep sigh, as though his heart failed him at the prospect, and well it might, for although young he was not robust, and over-driving, coupled with the weight and the chafing of the goree, had worn him to a skeleton. It was not the policy of the slave traders to take much care of their black ivory. They procured it so cheaply that it was easier and more profitable to lose or cast away some of it, than to put off time in resting and recruiting the weak. The moment it was observed, therefore, that the leading man hesitated, one of the drivers gave him a slash across his naked back with a heavy whip which at once drew blood. Poor wretch! He could ill bear further loss of the precious stream of life, for it had already been deeply drained from him by the slave stick. The chafing of that instrument of torture had not only worn the skin off his shoulders, but had cut into the quivering flesh, so that blood constantly dropped in small quantities from it. No cry burst from the man's lips on receiving the cruel blow, but he turned his eyes on his captors with a look that seemed to implore for mercy. As well might he have looked for mercy at the hands of Satan. The lash again fell on him with stinging force. He made a feeble effort to advance, staggered, and fell to the ground, dragging down the man to whom he was coupled with such violence as almost to break his neck. The lash was again about to be applied to make him rise, but Disco and Harold rose simultaneously and rushed at the driver, with what intent they scarcely knew, but four armed half castes stepped between them and the slave. "You had better not interfere," said Marizano, who stood close by. "Out of the way!" cried Harold fiercely, in the strength of his passion hurling aside the man who opposed him. "You shan't give him another cut," said Disco between his teeth, as he seized the driver by the throat. "We don't intend to do so," said Marizano coolly, while the driver released himself from the poor Disco's weakened grasp. "He won't need any more." The Englishmen required no explanation of these words. A glance told them that the man was dying. "Cut him out," said Marizano. One of his men immediately brought a saw and cut the fork of the stick which still held the living to the dying man, and which, being riveted on them, could not otherwise be removed. Harold and Disco lifted him up as soon as he was free, and carrying him a short distance aside to a soft part of the bank, laid him gently down. The dying slave looked as if he were surprised at such unwonted tenderness. There was even a slight smile on his lips for a few moments, but it quickly passed away with the fast ebbing tide of life. "Go fetch some water," said Harold. "His lips are dry." Disco rose and ran to fill a small cocoa nut shell which he carried at his girdle as a drinking cup. Returning with it, he moistened the man's lips and poured a little of the cool water on the raw sores on each side of his neck. They were so much engrossed with their occupation that neither of them observed that the slave gang had commenced to pass through the swamp, until the sharp cry of a child drew their attention to it for a moment; but knowing that they could do no good, they endeavoured to shut their eyes and ears to everything save the duty they had in hand. By degrees the greater part of the long line had got into the swamp, and were slowly toiling through it under the stimulus of the lash. Some, like the poor fellow who first fell, had sunk under their accumulated trials, and after a fruitless effort on the part of the slavers to drive them forward, had been kicked aside into the jungle, there to die, or to be torn in pieces by that ever watchful scavenger of the wilderness, the hyena. These were chiefly women, who, having become mothers not long before, were unable to carry their infants and keep up with the gang. Others, under the intense dread of flagellation, made the attempt, and staggered on a short distance, only to fall and be left behind in the pestilential swamp, where rank reeds and grass closed over them, and formed a ready grave. The difficulties of the swamp were, however, felt most severely by the children, who, from little creatures of not much more than 5 years of age to well grown boys and girls, were mingled with and chained to the adults along the line. Their comparatively short legs were not well adapted for such ground, and not a few of them perished there; but although the losses here were terribly numerous in one sense, they after all bore but a small portion to those whose native vigour carried them through in safety. Among the men there were some whose strength of frame and fierce expression indicated untameable spirits, men who might have been, probably were, heroes among their fellows. It was for men of this stamp that the goree or slave stick had been invented, and most effectually did that instrument serve its purpose. Samson himself would have been a mere child in it. There were men in the gang quite as bold, if not as strong, as Samson. One of these, a very tall and powerful negro, on drawing near to the place where Marizano stood superintending the passage, turned suddenly aside, and although coupled by the neck to a fellow slave, and securely bound at the wrists with a cord which was evidently cutting into his swelled flesh, made a desperate kick at the half caste leader. Although the slave failed to reach him, Marizano was so enraged that he drew a hatchet from his belt and instantly dashed out the man's brains. He fell dead without even a groan. Terrified by this, the rest passed on more rapidly, and there was no further check till a woman in line with an infant on her back stumbled, and falling down, appeared unable to rise. "Get up!" shouted Marizano, whose rage had rather been increased than abated by the murder he had just committed. The woman rose and attempted to advance, but seemed ready to fall again. Seeing this, Marizano plucked the infant from her back, dashed it against a tree, and flung its quivering body into the jungle, while a terrible application of the lash sent the mother shrieking into the swamp. Note, see Livingstone's Zambesi and its Tributaries, page 857, and for a record of cruelties too horrible to be set down in a book like this, we refer the reader to MacLeod's Travels in Eastern Africa, volume 2, page 26. Also to the appendix of Captain Sullivan's Dhow Chasing in Zanzibar Waters, which contains copious and interesting extracts from evidence taken before the Select Committee of the House of Commons. End of note. Harold and Disco did not witness this, though they heard the shriek of despair, for at the moment the negro they were tending was breathing his last. When his eyes had closed and the spirit had been set free, they rose, and purposely refraining from looking back, hurried away from the dreadful scene, intending to plunge into the swamp at some distance from the place, and push on until they should regain the head of the column. "Better if we'd never fallen behind, sir," said Disco in a deep, tremulous voice. "True," replied Harold. "We should have been spared these sights, and the pain of knowing that we cannot prevent this appalling misery and cruelty." "But surely it is to be prevented somehow," cried Disco, almost fiercely. "Many a war that has cost mints o' money has been carried on for causes that ain't worth mentionin' in the same breath with this." As Harold knew not what to say, and was toiling knee deep in the swamp at the moment, he made no reply. After marching about half an hour, he stopped abruptly, and said with a heavy sigh, "I hope we haven't missed our way?" "Hope not, sir, but it looks like as if we had. I've been so took up thinkin' of that accursed traffic in human bein's that I've lost my reckonin'. Howsever, we can't be far out, and with the sun to guide us, we'll " He was stopped by a loud halloo in the woods on the belt of the swamp. It was repeated in a few seconds, and Antonio, who, with Jumbo, had followed his master, cried in an excited tone "Me knows that sound. What may it be, Tony?" There was neither time nor need for an answer, for at that moment a ringing cry, something like a bad imitation of a British cheer, was heard, and a band of men sprang out of the woods and ran at full speed towards our Englishmen. "Why, Zombo!" exclaimed Disco wildly. "Oliveira!" cried Harold. "Masiko! Sangolo!" shouted Antonio and Jumbo. "And Jose, Nakoda, Chimbola, Mabruco, the whole bun of 'em!" cried Disco, as one after another these worthies emerged from the wood and rushed in a state of frantic excitement towards their friends. "Hooray! Hooroo hay!" replied the runners. In another minute our adventurous party of travellers was reunited, and for some time nothing but wild excitement, congratulations, queries that got no replies, and replies that ran tilt at irrelevant queries, with confusion worse confounded by explosions of unbounded and irrepressible laughter, not unmingled with tears, was the order of the hour. "But what, you's ill?" cried Zombo suddenly, looking into Disco's face with an anxious expression. "Well, I ain't 'xactly ill, nor I ain't 'xactly well neither, but I'm hearty all the same, and werry glad to see your black face, Zombo." "Ha! Hooroo hay! So me's for see you," cried the excitable Zombo. "But come, not good for talkee in de knees to water. Fall in, boy, ho! Shalloums, quick mash!" That Zombo had assumed command of his party was made evident by the pat way in which he trolled off the words of command formerly taught to him by Harold, as well as by the prompt obedience that was accorded to his orders. He led the party out of the swamp, and on reaching a dry spot halted in order to make further inquiries and answer questions. "How did you find us, Zombo?" asked Harold, throwing himself wearily on the ground. "You's ill," said Zombo, holding up a finger by way of rebuke. "So I am.
though not so ill as I look. But come, answer me, how came you to discover us? You could not have found us by mere chance in this wilderness." "Chance? What am chance?" asked the Makololo. There was some difficulty in getting Antonio to explain the word, from the circumstances of himself being ignorant of it. Therefore Harold put the question in a more direct form. "Oh, we comes here look for you, 'cause people's dreckums show de way. We's been weeks, months, oh, days look for you. Travel far, wrong road, turnin' back, try 'gin, find you now. Hooroo hay!" "You may say that indeed. I'll have it in my heart," said Disco, "to give 3 good rousin' British cheers if it weren't for the thoughts of that black-hearted villain Marizano and his poor miserable slaves." "Marizano!" shouted Chimbolo, glaring at Harold. "Marizano!" echoed Zombo, glaring at Disco. Harold now explained to his friends that the slave hunter was close at hand, a piece of news which visibly excited them, and described the cruelties of which he had recently been a witness. Zombo showed his teeth like a savage mastiff, and grasped his musket as though he longed to use it, but he uttered no word until the narrative reached that point in which the death of the poor captive was described. Then he suddenly started forward, and said something to his followers in the native tongue, which caused each to fling down the small bundle that was strapped to his shoulders. "You stop here," he cried earnestly, as he turned to Harold and Disco. "We's come back soon. Ho, boys, shoulder 'ums, quick mash!" No trained band of Britons ever obeyed with more ready alacrity. No attention was paid to Harold's question. The "quick mash" carried them out of sight in a few minutes, and when the Englishmen, who had run after them a few paces, halted, under the conviction that in their weak condition they might as well endeavour to keep up with race horses as with their old friends, they found that Antonio alone remained to keep them company. "Where's Jumbo?" inquired Harold. "Gone 'way with others," replied the interpreter. Examining the bundles of their friends, they found that their contents were powder, ball, and food. It was therefore resolved that a fire should be kindled and food prepared, to be ready for their friends on their return. "I'm not so sure about their return," said Harold gravely. "They will have to fight against fearful odds if they find the slavers. Foolish fellows, I wish they had not rushed away so madly without consulting us." The day passed. Night came and passed also, and another day dawned, but there was no appearance of Zombo and his men until the sun had been up for some hours. Then they came back, wending their way slowly, very slowly, through the woods, with the whole of the slave gang, men, women, and children, at their heels. "Where is Marizano?" inquired Harold, almost breathless with surprise. "Dead," said Zombo. "Dead?" "Ay, dead. Couldn't be deader." "And his armed followers?" "Dead too, some of 'ems. We got at 'em in de night. Shot at Marizano all to hatoms. Shot at most ob followers too. De rest all scatter like leaves in de wind. Me give up now," added Zombo, handing his musket to Harold. "Boys, orums, me's captain not no more. Now, Capitin Harold, youse once more look after us, and take care of all 'em's people." Having thus demitted his charge, the faithful Zombo stepped back and left our hero in the unenviable position of a half broken down man with the responsibility of conducting an expedition and disposing of a large gang of slaves in some unknown part of equatorial Africa. Leaving him there, we will proceed at once to the coast and follow, for a time, the fortunes of that arch villain, Yoosoof. Chapter 21. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom's Audiobooks.com. Chapter 22 of Black Ivory by R.M. Ballantyne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22 describes Black Ivory at sea. Having started for the coast with a large gang of slaves a short time before Marizano, as we have already said, and having left the Englishmen to the care of the half caste, chiefly because he did not desire their company, although he had no objection to the ransom,
Yoosoof proceeded over the same track which we have already described in part, leaving a bloody trail behind him. It is a fearful track of about 500 miles in length, that which lies between the head of Lake Nyassa and the sea-coast at Kilwa. We have no intention of dragging the reader over it to witness the cruelties and murders that were perpetrated by the slavers, or the agonies endured by the slaves. Livingstone speaks of it as a land of death, of desolation, and dead men's bones, and no wonder, for it is one of the main arteries through which the blood of Africa flows like the water of natural rivers to the sea. The slave gangs are perpetually passing eastward through it, perpetually dropping 4/5 of their numbers on it as they go. Dr. Livingstone estimates that, in some cases, not more than 1/10 of the slaves captured reach the sea-coast alive. It is, therefore, rather under than overstating the case to say that out of every 100 starting from the interior, 80 perish on the road. Yoosoof left with several thousands of strong and healthy men, women, and children. Most of them being children, he arrived at Kilwa with only 800. The rest had sunk by the way, either from exhaustion or cruel treatment, or both. The loss was great, but as regards the trader it could not be called severe, because the whole gang of slaves cost him little, some of them even nothing, and the remaining 800 would fetch a good price. They were miserably thin indeed, and exhibited on their poor, worn, and travel-stained bodies the evidence of many a cruel castigation. But Yoosoof knew that a little rest and good feeding at Kilwa would restore them to some degree of marketable value, and at Zanzibar he was pretty sure of obtaining, in round numbers, about £10 a head for them, while in the Arabian and Persian ports he could obtain much more if he chose to pass beyond the treaty-protected water at Lamu, and run the risk of being captured by British cruisers. It is piracy to carry slaves north of Lamu. South of that point for hundreds of miles, robbery, rapine, murder, cruelty, such as devils could not excel if they were to try, is a domestic institution with which Britons are pledged not to interfere. Since the above was written, Sir Bartle Frere has returned from his mission, and we are told that a treaty has been signed by the Sultan of Zanzibar, putting an end to this domestic slavery. We have not yet seen the terms of this treaty, and must go to press before it appears. We have reason to rejoice and be thankful, however, that such an advantage has been gained. But let not the reader imagine that this settles the question of East African slavery. Portugal still holds to the domestic institution in her colonies, and has decreed that it shall not expire till the year 1878. Decreed, in fact, that the horrors which we have attempted to depict shall continue for 5 years longer. And let it be noted that the export slave trade cannot be stopped as long as domestic slavery is permitted. Besides this, there is a continual drain of human beings from Africa through Egypt. Sir Samuel Baker's mission is a blow aimed at that, but nothing that we know of is being done in regard to Portuguese wickedness. If the people of this country could only realise the frightful state of things that exists in the African Portuguese territory, and knew how many thousand bodies shall be racked with torture, and souls be launched into eternity during these 5 years, they would indignantly insist that Portugal should be compelled to stop it at once. If it is righteous to constrain the Sultan of Zanzibar, is it not equally so to compel the King of Portugal? The arch robber and murderer, Yoosoof, smooth and oily of face, tongue, and manner though he was, possessed a bold spirit and a grasping heart. The domestic institution did not suit him. Rather than sneak along his villainous course under its protecting pass, he resolved to bid defiance to laws, treaties, and men of war to boot, as many hundreds of his compeers have done and do, and make a bold dash to the north with his 800 specimens of black ivory. Accordingly, full of his purpose, one afternoon he sauntered up to the barracoons in which his cattle were being rested and fed up. Moosa, his chief driver, was busy among them with a lash, for like other cattle they had a tendency to rebel, at least a few of them had. The most of them were by that time reduced to the callous condition which had struck Harold and Disco so much on the occasion of their visits to the slave market of Zanzibar. Moosa was engaged, when Yoosoof entered, in whipping most unmercifully a small boy whose piercing shrieks had no influence whatever on his tormentor. Close beside them a large, strong-boned man lay stretched on the ground. He had just been felled with a heavy stick by Moosa for interfering. He had raised himself on one elbow, while with his right hand he wiped away the blood that oozed from the wound in his head, and appeared to struggle to recover himself from the stunning blow. "What has he been doing?" asked Yoosoof carelessly in Portuguese. "Oh, the old story, rebelling," said Moosa, savagely hurling the boy into the midst of a group of cowering children, amongst whom he instantly shrank as much as possible out of sight. "That brute," pointing to the prostrate man, "was a chief, it appears, in his own country, and has not yet got all the spirit lashed out of him. But it can't last much longer. Either the spirit or the life must go. He has carried that little whelp the last part of the way on his back, and now objects to part with him. Got fond of him, I fancy. If you had taken my advice, you would have cast them both to the hyenas long ago." "You are a bad judge of human flesh, Moosa," said Yoosoof quietly. "More than once you have allowed your passion to rob me of a valuable piece of goods. This man will fetch good price in Persia, and so will his son. I know that the child is his son, though the fool thinks no one knows that but himself, and rather prides himself on the clever way in which he has continued to keep his whelp beside him on the journey down. Bah! What can one expect from such cattle? Don't separate them, Moosa. They will thrive better together. If we only get them to market in good condition, then we can sell them in separate lots without risking loss of value from pining." In a somewhat sulky tone, for he was not pleased to be found fault with by his chief, the slave driver ordered out the boy, who was little more than 5 years old, though the careworn expression on his thin face seemed to indicate a much more advanced age. Trembling with alarm, for he expected a repetition of the punishment, yet not daring to disobey, the child came slowly out from the midst of his hapless companions, and advanced. The man, who had partly recovered, rose to a sitting position, and regarded Moosa and the Arab with a look of hatred so intense that it is quite certain he would have sprung at them if the heavy slave stick had not rendered such an act impossible. "Go, you little whelp," said Moosa, pointing to the fallen chief, and at the same time giving the child a cut with the whip. With a cry of mingled pain and delight, poor Obo, for it was he, rushed into his father's open arms, and laid his sobbing head on his breast. He could not nestle into his neck as, in the days of old, he had been wont to do. The rough Goree effectually prevented that. Kambira bent his head over the child, and remained perfectly still. He did not dare to move, lest any action, however inoffensive, might induce Moosa to change his mind and separate them again. Poor Kambira! How different from the hardy, bold, kindly chief to whom we introduced the reader in his own wilderness home! His colossal frame was now gaunt in the extreme, and so thin that every rib stood out as though it would burst from the skin, and every joint seemed hideously large, while from head to foot his skin was crossed and recrossed with terrible weals, and scarred with open sores, telling of the horrible cruelties to which he had been subjected in the vain attempt to tame his untamable spirit. There can be no question that, if he had been left to the tender mercies of such Portuguese half caste scoundrels as Moosa or Marizano, he would have been brained with an axe, or whipped to death long ago. But Yoosoof was more cool and calculating in his cruelty. He had more respect for his pocket than for the gratification of his angry feelings. Therefore Kambira had reached the coast alive. Little had the simple chief imagined what awaited him on that coast, and on his way to it, when, in the fulness of his heart, he had stated to Harold Seadrift his determination to proceed thither in search of Azinte. Experience had now crushed hope and taught him to despair. There was but one gleam of light in his otherwise black sky, and that was the presence of his boy. Life had still one charm in it, as long as he could lay hold of Obo's little hand and hoist him, not quite so easily as of yore, on his broad shoulders. Yoosoof was sufficiently a judge of human character to be aware that if he separated these two, Kambira would become more dangerous to approach than the fiercest monster in the African wilderness. "We must sail to night and take our chances," said Yoosoof, turning away from his captives. "The time allowed for our trade is past, and I shall run straight north without delay." The Arab here referred to the fact that the period of the year allowed by treaty for the lawful slave trade of the Zanzibar dominions had come to an end. That period extended over several months, and during its course passes from the Sultan's secured domestic slavers against the British cruisers. After its expiration no export of slaves was permitted anywhere. Nevertheless, a very large export was carried on, despite non-permission and cruisers. Yoosoof meant to run the blockade and take his chance. "How many dhows have you got?" asked Yoosoof. "3," replied Moosa. "That will do," replied the Arab after a few minutes' thought. "It will be a tight fit at first, perhaps, but a few days at sea will rectify that. Even in the most healthy season and favourable conditions we must unfortunately count on a good many losses. We shall sail to morrow." The morrow came, and 3 dhows left the harbour of Kilwa, hoisted their lateen sails, and steered northwards. They were densely crowded with slaves. Even to the eye of a superficial observer this would have been patent, for the upper deck of each was so closely packed with black men, women, and children that a square inch of it could not anywhere be seen. They were packed very systematically, in order to secure economical stowage. Each human being sat on his haunches with his thighs against his breast and his knees touching his chin. They were all ranged thus in rows, shoulder to shoulder and back to shin, so that the deck was covered with a solid phalanx of human flesh. Change of posture was not provided for. It was not possible. There was no awning over the upper deck. The tropical sun poured its rays on the heads of the slaves all day. The dews fell on them all night. The voyage might last for days or weeks, but there was no relief to the wretched multitude. For no purpose whatever could they move from their terrible position, save for the one purpose of being thrown overboard when dead. But we have only spoken of the upper deck of these dhows. Beneath this there was a temporary bamboo deck, with just space sufficient to admit of men being seated in the position above referred to. This was also crowded, but it was not the black hole of the vessel. That was lower still. Seated on the stone ballast beneath the bamboo deck there was yet another layer of humanity, whose condition can neither be described nor conceived. Without air, without light, without room to move, without hope, with insufferable stench, with hunger and thirst, with heat unbearable, with agony of body and soul, with dread anticipations of the future and despairing memories of the past, they sat for days and nights together, fed with just enough of uncooked rice and water to keep soul and body together. Not enough in all cases, however, for many succumbed, especially among the women and children. Down in the lowest, filthiest, and darkest corner of this foul hold sat Kambira, with little Obo crushed against his shins. It may be supposed that there was a touch of mercy in this arrangement. Let not the reader suppose so. Yoosoof knew that if Kambira was to be got to market alive, Obo must go along with him. Moosa also knew that if the strong-minded chief was to be subdued at all, it would only be by the most terrible means. Hence his position in the dhow. There was a man seated alongside of Kambira who for some time had appeared to be ill. He could not be seen, for the place was quite dark, save when a man came down with a lantern daily to serve out rice and water. But Kambira knew that he was very ill from his groans and the quiverings of his body. One night these groans ceased, and the man leaned heavily on the chief. Not very heavily, however, he was too closely wedged in all round to admit of that. Soon afterwards he became very cold, and Kambira knew that he was dead. All that night, and the greater part of next day, the dead man sat propped up by his living comrades. When the daily visitor came down, attention was drawn to the body, and it was removed. Moosa, who was in charge of this dhow, Yoosoof having command of another, gave orders to have the slaves in the holds examined, and it was discovered that 3 others were dead and 2 dying. The dead were thrown overboard, the dying were left till they died, and then followed their released comrades. But now a worse evil befell that dhow. Smallpox broke out among the slaves. It was a terrible emergency, but Moosa was quite equal to it. Ordering the infected and suspected slaves to be brought on deck, he examined them. In this operation he was assisted and accompanied by 2 powerful armed men. There were passengers on board the dhow, chiefly Arabs, and a crew as well as slaves. The passengers and crew together numbered about 34, all of whom were armed to the teeth. To these this inspection was of great importance, for it was their interest to get rid of the deadly disease as fast as possible. The first slave inspected, a youth of about 15, was in an advanced stage of the disease, in fact, dying. A glance was sufficient, and at a nod from Moosa, the 2 powerful men seized him and hurled him into the sea. The poor creature was too far gone even to struggle for life. He sank like a stone. Several children followed. They were unquestionably smitten with the disease, and were at once thrown overboard. Whether the passengers felt pity or no, we cannot say. They expressed none, but looked on in silence. So far the work was easy, but when men and women were brought up on whom the disease had not certainly taken effect, Moosa was divided between the desire to check the progress of the evil and the desire to save valuable property. The property itself also caused some trouble in a few instances, for when it became obvious to 1 or 2 of the stronger slave girls and men what was going to be done with them, they made a hard struggle for their lives, and the 2 strong men were under the necessity of using a knife, now and then, to facilitate the accomplishment of their purpose. But such cases were rare. Most of the victims were carelessly submissive. It might not be beyond the truth in some cases to say willingly submissive. Each day this scene was enacted, for Moosa was a very determined man, and full 40 human beings were thus murdered, but the disease was not stayed. The effort to check it was therefore given up, and the slaves were left to recover or die where they sat. Note: see account of capture of dhow by Captain Robert B. Kay of H.M.S. Vulture in the Times of India, 1872. End of note. While this was going on in the vessel commanded by Moosa, the other 2 dhows under Yoosoof and a man named Suliman had been lost sight of, but this was a matter of little moment, as they were all bound for the same Persian port, and were pretty sure, British cruisers permitting, to meet there at last. Meanwhile the dhow ran short of water, and Moosa did not like to venture at that time to make the land, lest he should be caught by one of the hated cruisers or their boats. He preferred to let the wretched slaves take their chance of dying of thirst, hoping, however, to lose only a few of the weakness, as water could be procured a little farther north with greater security. Thus the horrible work of disease, death, and murder went on, until an event occurred which entirely changed the aspect of affairs on board the dhow. Early one morning Moosa directed the head of his vessel towards the land with the intention of procuring the much needed water. At the same hour and place 2 cutters belonging to H.M.S. Firefly, armed with gun and rocket, 20 men, and an interpreter, crept out under sail with the fishing boats from a neighbouring village. They were under the command of Lieutenants Small and Lindsay respectively. For some days they had been there keeping vigilant watch, but had seen no dhows, and that morning were proceeding out rather depressed by the influence of hope deferred, when a sail was observed in the offing, or rather a mast, for the sail of the dhow had been lowered, the owners intending to wait until the tide should enable them to cross the bar. "Out oars and give way, lads," was the immediate order, for it was necessary to get up all speed on the boats if the dhow was to be reached before she had time to hoist her huge sail. "I hope the haze will last," earnestly muttered Lieutenant Small in the first cutter. "Oh, that they may keep on sleeping for 5 minutes more," excitedly whispered Lieutenant Lindsay in the second cutter. These hopes were coupled with orders to have the gun and rocket in readiness. But the haze would not last to oblige Mr. Small, neither would the Arabs keep on sleeping to please Mr. Lindsay. On the contrary, the haze dissipated, and the Arabs observed and recognized their enemies when within about half a mile. With wonderful celerity they hoisted sail and stood out to sea in the full swing of the monsoon. There was no little probability that the boats would fail to overhaul a vessel with so large a sail, therefore other means were instantly resorted to. "Fire!" said Mr. Small. "Fire!" cried Mr. Lindsay. Bang went the gun, whiz went the rocket, almost at the same moment. A rapid rifle fire was also opened on the slaver. Shot, rocket, and ball bespattered the sea and scattered foam in the air, but did no harm to the dhow, a heavy sea and a strong wind preventing accuracy of aim. "Give it them as fast as you can," was now the order. And well was the order obeyed, for bluejackets are notoriously smart men in action, and the gun, the rocket, and the rifles kept up a smart iron storm for upwards of 2 hours, during which time the exciting chase lasted. At last Jackson, the linguist who was in the stern of Lindsay's boat, mortally wounded the steersman of the dhow with a rifle ball at a distance of about 600 yards. Not long afterwards the rocket cutter, being less heavily weighted than her consort, crept ahead, and when within about 150 yards of the slaver, let fly a well-directed rocket. It carried away the parrel which secured the yard of the dhow to the mast, and brought the sail down instantly on the deck. "Hurrah!" burst irresistibly from the bluejackets. The Arabs were doubly overwhelmed, for besides getting the sail down on their heads, they were astonished and stunned by the shriek, smoke, and flame of the war rocket. The gun cutter coming up at the moment, the two boats ranged alongside of the slaver and boarded together. As we have said, the crew and passengers, numbering 34, were armed to the teeth, and they had stood by the halyards during the chase with drawn creeses, swearing to kill anyone who should attempt to shorten sail. These now appeared for a moment as though they meditated resistance, but the irresistible dash of the sailors seemed to change their mind, for they submitted without striking a blow, though many of them were very reluctant to give up their swords and knives. Fortunately the `Firefly' arrived in search of her boats that evening, and the slaves were transferred to her deck. But who shall describe the harrowing scene? The dhow seemed a very nest of black ants, it was so crowded, and the sailors who had to perform the duty of removing the slaves were nearly suffocated by the horrible stench. Few of the slaves could straighten themselves after their long confinement. Indeed, some of them were unable to stand for days afterwards, and many died on board the `Firefly' before they reached a harbour of refuge and freedom. Those taken from the hold were in the worst condition, especially the children, many of whom were in the most loathsome stages of smallpox and scrofula of every description. They were so emaciated and weak that many had to be carried on board and lifted for every movement. Kambira, although able to stand, was doubled up like an old man, and poor little Obo trembled and staggered when he attempted to follow his father, to whom he still clung as to his last and only refuge. To convey these poor wretches to a place where they could be cared for was now Captain Romer's chief anxiety. First, however, he landed the crew and passengers, with the exception of Moosa and 3 of his men. The filthy dhow was then scuttled and sunk, after which the `Firefly' steamed away for Aden, that being the nearest port where the rescued slaves could be landed and set free. Chapter 22. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom's Audiobooks.com. Chapter 23 of Black Ivory by R.M. Ballantyne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23. The Remedy. Reader, we will turn aside at this point to preach you a lay sermon, if you will lend an attentive ear. It shall be brief and straight to the point. Our text is, Prevention and Cure. There are at least three great channels by which the lifeblood of Africa is drained. One trends to the east through the Zanzibar dominions, another to the southeast through the Portuguese dependencies, and a third to the north through Egypt. If the slave trade is to be effectually checked, the flow through these three channels must be stopped. It is vain to rest content with the stoppage of one leak in our ship, if two other leaks are left open. Happily, in regard to the first of these channels, Sir Bartle Frere has been successful in making a grand stride in the way of prevention. If the Sultan of Zanzibar holds to his treaty engagements, domestic slavery in his dominions is at an end. Nevertheless, our fleet will be required just as much as ever to prevent the unauthorized piratical slave trade, and this, after all, is but one-third of the preventive work we have to do. Domestic slavery remains untouched in the Portuguese dependencies, and Portugal has decreed that it shall remain untouched until the year 1878. It is well that we should be thoroughly impressed with the fact that so long as slavery in any form is tolerated, the internal, we may say infernal, miseries and horrors which we have attempted to depict will continue to blight the land and brutalize its people. Besides this, justice demands that the same constraint which we lay on the Sultan of Zanzibar should be applied to the King of Portugal. We ought to insist that his domestic slavery shall cease at once. Still further, as Sir Bartle Frere himself has recommended, we should urge upon our government the appointment of efficient consular establishments in the Portuguese dependencies, as well as vigilance in securing the observance of the treaties signed by the Sultans of Zanzibar and Muscat. A recent telegram from Sir Samuel Baker assures us that a great step has been made in the way of checking the tide of slavery in the third, the Egyptian channel, and Sir Bartle Frere bears testimony to the desire of the Khedive that slavery should be put down in his dominions. For this we have reason to be thankful, and the appearance of affairs in that quarter is hopeful. But our hope is mingled with anxiety, because mankind is terribly prone to go to sleep on hopeful appearances. Our nature is such that our only chance of success lies, under God, in resolving ceaselessly to energize until our ends be accomplished. We must see to it that the Khedive of Egypt acts in accordance with his professions, and for this end efficient consular agency is as needful in the northeast as in the southeast. So much for prevention, but prevention is not cure. In order to accomplish this, two things are necessary. There must be points or centres of refuge for the oppressed on the mainland of Africa, and there must be the introduction of the Bible. The first is essential to the second. Where anarchy, murder, injustice, and tyranny are rampant and triumphant, the advance of the missionary is either terribly slow or altogether impossible. The life-giving, soul-softening Word of God is the only remedy for the woes of mankind, and therefore the only cure for Africa. To introduce it effectually, and along with it civilization and all the blessings that flow therefrom, it is indispensable that Great Britain should obtain, by treaty or by purchase, one or more small pieces of land, there to establish free Christian negro settlements, and there with force sufficient to defend them from the savages, and worse than savages, the Arab and Portuguese half-caste barbarians and lawless men who infest the land, hold out the hand of friendship to all natives who choose to claim her protection from the man-stealer, and offer to teach them the blessed truths of Christianity and the arts of civilization. Many of the men who are best fitted to give an opinion on the point agree in holding that some such centre or centres on the mainland are essential to the permanent cure of slavery, although they differ a little as to the best localities for them. Take, for instance, Dar es Salaam on the coast, the Manganja highlands near the river Shire, and Khartoum on the Nile. 3 such centres would, if established, begin at once to dry up the slave trade at its 3 fountain heads, while our cruisers would check it on the coast. In these centres of light and freedom the negroes might see exemplified the blessings of Christianity and civilization, and thence trained native missionaries might radiate into all parts of the vast continent, armed only with the word of God, the shield of faith, and the sword of the Spirit, in order to preach the glad tidings of salvation through Jesus Christ our Lord. In brief, the great points on which we ought as a nation to insist are the immediate abolition of the slave trade in Portuguese dependencies, the scrupulous fulfilment of treaty obligations by the Sultans of Zanzibar and Muscat, the Shah of Persia, and the Khedive of Egypt, the establishment by our government of efficient consular agencies where such are required, the acquisition of territory on the mainland for the purposes already mentioned, and the united action of all Christians in our land to raise funds and send men to preach the gospel to the negro. So doing, we shall, with God's blessing, put an end to the Eastern slave trade, save Equatorial Africa, and materially increase the commerce, the riches, and the happiness of the world. End of chapter 23. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 24 of Black Ivory by R. M. Ballantyne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24 tells of sad sights and sudden events, and unexpected meetings. In the course of time our hero Harold Seadrift and his faithful ally Disco Lillihammer, after innumerable adventures which we are unwillingly obliged to pass over in silence, returned to the coast, and, in the course of their wanderings in search of a vessel which should convey them to Zanzibar, found themselves at last in the town of Governor Letotti. Being English travellers, they were received as guests by the Governor, and Harold was introduced to Senhorina Maraquita. Passing through the market-place one day, they observed a crowd round the flagstaff in the centre of the square, and following the irresistible tendency of human nature in such circumstances, ran to see what was going on. They found that a slave was about to be publicly whipped by soldiers. The unhappy man was suspended by the wrists from the flagstaff, and a single cord of coir round his waist afforded him additional support. "Come away, we can do no good here," said Harold in a low, sorrowful tone, which was drowned in the shriek of the victim as the first lash fell on his naked shoulders. "P'raps he's a criminal," suggested Disco as he hurried away, endeavouring to comfort himself with the thought that the man probably deserved punishment. "It's not the whippin' I think so much of," he asked. "That is the only thing as will do for some characters, but it's the awful cruelties that goes along with it." Returning through the same square about an hour later, having almost forgotten about the slave by that time, they were horrified to observe that the wretched man was still hanging there. Hastening towards him, they found that he was gasping for breath. His veins were bursting, and his flesh was deeply lacerated by the cords with which he was suspended. He turned his head as the Englishmen approached, and spoke a few words which they did not understand. But the appealing look of his bloodshot eyes spoke a language that required no interpreter. At an earlier period in their career in Africa, both Harold and Disco would have acted on their first impulse and cut the man down. But experience had taught them that this style of interference, while it put their own lives in jeopardy, had sometimes the effect of increasing the punishment and suffering of those whom they sought to befriend. Acting on a wiser plan, they resolved to appeal to Governor Letotti in his behalf. They therefore ran to his residence, where Maraquita, who conversed with Harold in French, informed them that her father was in the Gereza, or public palaver house. To that building they hastened, and found that it was in the very square they had left. But Senhor Letotti was not there. He had observed the Englishmen coming, and, having a shrewd guess what their errand was, had disappeared and hid himself. His chief officer informed them that he had left the town early in the morning, and would not return till the afternoon. Harold felt quite sure that this was a falsehood, but of course was obliged to accept it as truth. "Is there no one to act for the Governor in his absence?" he asked anxiously. No, there was no one, but after a few minutes the chief officer appeared to be overcome by Harold's earnest entreaties, and said that he could take upon himself to act, that he would suspend the punishment till the Governor's return, when Harold might prefer his petition to him in person. Accordingly the slave was taken down. In the afternoon Harold saw the Governor, and explained that he did not wish to interfere with his province as a magistrate, but that what he had witnessed was so shocking that he availed himself of his privilege as a guest to pray that the man's punishment might be mitigated. Governor Letotti's health had failed him of late, and he had suffered some severe disappointments in money matters, so that his wonted amiability had been considerably reduced. He objected at first to interfere with the course of justice, but finally gave a reluctant consent, and the man was pardoned. Afterwards, however, when our travellers were absent from the town for a day, the wretched slave was again tied up, and the full amount of his punishment inflicted. In other words, he was flogged to death. For the incident on which this is founded we are indebted to the Reverend Dr. Ryan, late Bishop of the Mauritius. This incident had such effect on the mind of Harold that he resolved no longer to accept the hospitality of Governor Letotti. He had some difficulty, however, in persuading himself to carry his resolve into effect, for the Governor, although harsh in his dealing with the slave, had been exceedingly kind and amiable to himself. But an unexpected event occurred which put an end to his difficulties. This was the illness and sudden death of his host. Poor disconsolate Maraquita, in the first passion of her grief, fled to the residence of the only female friend she had in the town, and refused firmly to return home. Thus it came to pass that Harold's intercourse with the Senhorina was cut short at its commencement, and thus he missed the last opportunity of learning something of the fortunes of Azinte. For it is certain that, if they had conversed much together, as would probably have been the case had her father lived, some mention of the slave girl's name could not fail to have been made, and their mutual knowledge of her to have been elicited and interchanged. In those days there was no regular communication between one point and another of the east coast of Africa and the neighbouring islands. Travellers had frequently to wait long for a chance, and when they got one were often glad to take advantage of it without being fastidious as to its character. Soon after the events above narrated, a small trading schooner touched at the port. It was bound for the Seychelles, intending to return by Zanzibar and Madagascar, and proceed to the Cape. Harold would rather have gone direct to Zanzibar, but having plenty of time on his hands, as well as means, he was content to avail himself of the opportunity, and took passage in the schooner for himself, Disco, and Jumbo. That sable and faithful friend was the only one of his companions who was willing to follow him anywhere on the face of the earth. The others received their pay and their discharge with smiling faces, and scattered to their several homes, Antonio departing to complete his interrupted honeymoon. Just before leaving, Harold sought and obtained permission to visit Maraquita, to bid her good bye. The poor child was terribly overwhelmed by the death of her father, and could not speak of him without giving way to passionate grief. She told Harold that she meant to leave the coast by the first opportunity that should offer, and proceed to the Cape of Good Hope, where, in some part of the interior, lived an old aunt, the only relative she now had on earth, who she knew would be glad to receive her. Our hero did his best to comfort the poor girl, and expressed deep sympathy with her, but felt that his power to console her was very small indeed. After a brief interview, he bade her farewell. The voyage which our travellers now commenced was likely to be of considerable duration, for the Seychelles Islands lie a long way to the eastward of Africa, but as we have said, time was of no importance to Harold, and he was not sorry to have an opportunity of visiting a group of islands which are of some celebrity in connection with the East African slave trade. Thus, all unknown to himself or Disco, as well as to Maraquita, who would have been intensely interested had she known the fact, he was led towards the new abode of our sable heroine, Azinte. But alas for Kambira and Obo! They were being conveyed also, of course, unknown to themselves or to any one else, further and further away from one whom they would have given their heart's blood to meet with and embrace, and it seemed as if there was not a chance of any gleam of light bridging over the ever widening gulf that lay between them, for although Lieutenant Lindsay knew that Azinte had been left at the Seychelles, he had not the remotest idea that Kambira was Azinte's husband, and among several hundreds of freed slaves the second lieutenant of the `Firefly' was not likely to single out and hold converse with a chief whose language he did not understand, and who, as far as appearances went, was almost as miserable, sickly, and degraded as were the rest of the unhappy beings by whom he was surrounded. Providence, however, turned the tide of affairs in favour of Kambira and his son. On reaching Zanzibar, Captain Romer had learned from the commander of another cruiser that Aden was at that time somewhat overwhelmed with freed slaves, a considerable number of captives having been recently made about the neighbourhood of that great rendezvous of slavers, the island of Socotra. The captain therefore changed his mind, and once more very unwillingly directed his course towards the distant Seychelles. On the way thither many of the poor negroes died, but many began to recover strength under the influence of kind treatment and generous diet. Among these latter was Kambira. His erect gait and manly look soon began to return, and his ribs, so to speak, to disappear. It was otherwise with poor Obo. The severity of the treatment to which he had been exposed was almost too much for so young a frame. He lost appetite and slowly declined, notwithstanding the doctor's utmost care. This state of things continuing until the `Firefly' arrived at the Seychelles, Obo was at once conveyed to the hospital which we have referred to as having been established there. Azinte chanced to be absent in the neighbouring town on some errand connected with her duties as nurse, when her boy was laid down on his bed beside a number of similar sufferers. It was a sad sight to behold these little ones. Out of the original 83 children who had been placed there, 47 had died in 3 weeks, and the remnant were still in a pitiable condition. While on their beds of pain, tossing about in their delirium, the minds of these little ones frequently ran back to their forest homes, and while some in spirit laughed and romped once more around their huts, thousands of miles away on the banks of some African river, others called aloud in their sufferings for the dearest of all earthly beings to them, their mothers. Some of them also whispered the name of Jesus, for the missionary had been careful to tell them the story of our loving Lord, while tending their poor bodies. Obo had fevered slightly, and in the restless half slumber into which he fell on being put to bed, he too called earnestly for his mother. In his case, poor child, the call was not in vain. Lieutenant Lindsay and the doctor of the ship with Kambira had accompanied Obo to the hospital. "Now, Lindsay," said the doctor, when the child had been made as comfortable as circumstances would admit of, "this man must not be left here, for he will be useless, and it is of the utmost consequence that the child should have some days of absolute repose. What shall we do with him?" "Take him on board again," said Lindsay. "I dare say we shall find him employment for a short time." "If you will allow me to take charge of him," interposed the missionary, who was standing by them at the time, "I can easily find him employment in the neighbourhood, so that he can come occasionally to see his child when we think it safe to allow him." "That will be the better plan," said the doctor, for as long as A short, sharp cry near the door of the room cut the sentence short. All eyes were turned in that direction, and they beheld Azinte gazing wildly at them, and standing as if transformed to stone. The instant Kambira saw his wife he leaped up as if he had received an electric shock, bounded forward like a panther, uttered a shout that did full credit to the chief of a warlike African tribe, and seized Azinte in his arms. No wonder that 36 little black heads leaped from 36 little white pillows, and displayed all the whites of 72 eyes that were anything but little, when this astonishing scene took place. But Kambira quickly recovered himself, and grasping Azinte by the arm, led her gently towards the bed which had just been occupied, and pointed to the little one that slumbered uneasily there. Strangely enough, just at the moment little Obo again whispered the word "Mother." Poor Azinte's eyes seemed ready to start from their sockets. She stretched out her arms and tried to rush towards her child, but Kambira held her back. "Obo is very sick," he said. "You must touch him tenderly." The chief looked into his wife's eyes, saw that she understood him, and let her go. Azinte crept softly to the bed, knelt down beside it, and put her arms so softly round Obo that she scarcely moved him, yet she gradually drew him towards her, until his head rested on her swelling bosom, and she pressed her lips tenderly upon his brow. It was an old familiar attitude which seemed to pierce the slumbers of the child with a pleasant reminiscence, and dissipate his malady, for he heaved a deep sigh of contentment, and sank into profound repose. "Good," said the doctor in a low tone, with a significant nod to Lindsay, when an interpreter had explained what had been already guessed by all present, that Kambira and Azinte were man and wife. "Obo has a better chance now of recovery than I had anticipated, for joy goes a long way towards effecting a cure. Come, we will leave them together." Kambira was naturally anxious to remain, but like all commanding spirits, he had long ago learned that cardinal virtue, obedience to whom obedience is due. When it was explained to him that it would be for Obo's advantage to be left alone with his mother for a time, he arose, bowed his head, and meekly followed his friends out of the room. Exactly 1 week from that date little Obo had recovered so much of his former health that he was permitted to go out into the air, and a few days later Lieutenant Lindsay resolved to take him and his father and mother on board the `Firefly' by way of a little ploy. In pursuance of this plan he set off from the hospital in company with Kambira, followed at a short distance by Azinte and Obo. Poor Lindsay! His heart was heavy while he did his best to convey in dumb show his congratulations to Kambira, for he saw in this unexpected reunion an insurmountable difficulty in the way of taking Azinte back to her former mistress, not that he had ever seen the remotest chance of his being able to achieve that desirable end before this difficulty arose. But love is at times insanely hopeful, just as at other times, and with equally little reason, it is madly despairing. He had just made some complicated signs with hands, mouth, and eyebrows, and had succeeded in rendering himself altogether incomprehensible to his sable companion, when, on rounding a turn of the path that led to the harbour, he found himself suddenly face to face with Harold Seadrift, Disco Lillihammer, and their follower Jumbo, all of whom had landed from a schooner which, about an hour before, had cast anchor in the bay. "Mr Lindsay! Mr Seadrift!" exclaimed each to the other simultaneously, for the reader will remember that they had met once before when our heroes were rescued from Yoosoof by the `Firefly.' "Kambira!" shouted Disco. "Azinte!" cried Harold, as our sable heroine came into view. "Obo!" roared the stricken mariner. Jumbo could only vent his feelings in an appalling yell and an impromptu war dance round the party, in which he was joined by Disco, who performed a hornpipe with oboe in his arms, to the intense delight of that convalescent youngster. Thus, laughing, questioning, shouting, and dancing, they all effervesced towards the shore like a band of lunatics just escaped from Bedlam. Chapter 24. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 25 of Black Ivory by R.M. Ballantyne. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25. The Last. "How comes it," said Lieutenant Lindsay to Harold, on the first favourable opportunity that occurred after the meeting described in the last chapter, "how comes it that you and Kambira know each other so well?" "I might reply by asking," said Harold with a smile, "how comes it that you are so well acquainted with Azinte? But before putting that question, I will give you a satisfactory answer to your own." Hereupon he gave a brief outline of those events, already narrated in full to the reader, which bore on his first meeting with the slave girl, and his subsequent sojourn with her husband. "After leaving the interior," continued our hero, "and returning to the coast, I visited various towns, in order to observe the state of the slaves in the Portuguese settlements, and truly what I saw was most deplorable. Demoralisation and cruelty, and the obstruction of lawful trade, prevailed everywhere. The settlements are to my mind a very pandemonium on earth. Every one seemed to me more or less affected by the accursed atmosphere that prevails. Of course there must be some exceptions. I met with one at the last town I visited, in the person of Governor Letotti." "Letotti!" exclaimed Lindsay, stopping abruptly. "Yes," said Harold in some surprise at the lieutenant's manner, "and a most amiable man he was." "Was? What do you mean? Is he dead?" exclaimed Lindsay, turning pale. "He died suddenly just before I left," said Harold. "And Maraquita, I mean his daughter, what of her?" asked the lieutenant, turning as red as he had previously turned pale. Harold noted the change, and a gleam of light seemed to break upon him as he replied "Poor girl! She was overwhelmed at first by the heavy blow. I had to quit the place almost immediately after the event." "Did you know her well?" asked Lindsay, with an uneasy glance at his companion's handsome face. "No. I had just been introduced to her shortly before her father's death, and have scarcely exchanged a dozen sentences with her. It is said that her father died in debt, but of course in regard to that I know nothing certainly. At parting she told me that she meant to leave the coast and go to stay with a relative at the Cape." The poor lieutenant's look on hearing this was so peculiar, not to say alarming, that Harold could not help referring to it, and Lindsay was so much overwhelmed by such unexpected news, and withal so strongly attracted by Harold's sympathetic manner, that he straightway made a confidant of him, told him of his love for Maraquita, of Maraquita's love for Azinte, of the utter impossibility of his being able to take Azinte back to her old mistress now that she had found her husband and child, even if it had been admissible for a lieutenant in the British Navy to return freed negroes again into slavery, and wound up with bitter lamentations as to his unhappy fate, and expressions of poignant regret that fighting and other desperate means, congenial and easy to his disposition, were not available in the circumstances. After which explosion he subsided, felt ashamed of having thus committed himself, and looked rather foolish. But Harold quickly put him at his ease. He entered on the subject with earnest gravity. "It strikes me, Lindsay," he said thoughtfully, after the lieutenant had finished, "that I can aid you in this affair. But you must not ask me how at present. Give me a few hours to think over it, and then I shall have matured my plans." Of course the lieutenant hailed with heartfelt gratitude the gleam of hope held out to him, and thus the friends parted for a time. That same afternoon Harold sat under a palm tree in company with Disco, Jumbo, Kambira, Azinte, and Obo. "How would you like to go with me to the Cape of Good Hope, Kambira?" asked Harold abruptly. "Whar dat?" asked the chief through Jumbo. "Far away to the south of Africa," answered Harold. "You know that you can never go back to your own land now, unless you want to be again enslaved." "Him say him no want to go back," interpreted Jumbo. "Got all him care for now, Azinte and Obo." "Then do you agree to go with me?" said Harold. To this Kambira replied heartily that he did. "Why, what do 'ee mean for to do with 'em?" asked Disco in some surprise. "I will get them comfortably settled there," replied Harold. "My father has a business friend in Cape Town who will easily manage to put me in the way of doing it. Besides, I have a particular reason for wishing to take Azinte there. Ask her, Jumbo, if she remembers a young lady named Senhorina Maraquita Letotti." To this Azinte replied that she did, and the way in which her eyes sparkled proved that she remembered her with intense pleasure. "Well, tell her," rejoined Harold, "that Maraquita has grieved very much at losing her, and is very anxious to get her back again, not as a slave, but as a friend, for no slavery is allowed in English settlements anywhere, and I am sure that Maraquita hates slavery as much as I do, though she is not English. So I intend to take her and Kambira and Obo to the Cape, where Maraquita is living, or will be living soon." "Ye don't stick at trifles, sir," said Disco, whose eyes, on hearing this, assumed a thoughtful, almost a troubled look. "My plan does not seem to please you," said Harold. "Please, sir! Why shouldn't it please me? In course you knows best. I was only a little puzzled, that's all." Disco said no more, but he thought a good deal, for he had noted the beauty and sprightliness of Maraquita, and the admiration with which Harold had first beheld her, and it seemed to him that this rather powerful method of attempting to gratify the Portuguese girl was proof positive that Harold had lost his heart to her. Harold guessed what was running in Disco's mind, but did not care to undeceive him, as, in doing so, he might run some risk of betraying the trust reposed in him by Lindsay. The captain of the schooner, being bound for the Cape after visiting Zanzibar, was willing to take these additional passengers, and the anxious lieutenant was induced to postpone total and irrevocable despair, although Maraquita being poor, and he being poor, and promotion in the service being very slow, he had little reason to believe his prospects much brighter than they were before. Poor fellow! Time passed on rapid wing, as time is notoriously prone to do, and the fortunes of our dramatis personae varied somewhat. Captain Romer continued to roam the eastern seas, along with brother captains, and spent his labour and strength in rescuing a few hundreds of captives from among the hundreds of thousands that were continually flowing out of unhappy Africa. Yoosoof and Moosa continued to throw a boatload or two of damaged cattle in the way of the British cruisers as a decoy, and succeeded on the whole pretty well in running full cargoes of valuable black ivory to the northern markets. The Sultan of Zanzibar continued to assure the British Consul that he heartily sympathised with England in her desire to abolish slavery, and to allow his officials, for a consideration, to prosecute the slave trade to any extent they pleased. Portugal continued to assure England of her sympathy and co operation in the good work of repression, and her subjects on the east coast of Africa continued to export thousands of slaves under the protection of the Portuguese and French flags, styling them free engages. British Indian subjects, the Banyans of Zanzibar, continued to furnish the sinews of war which kept the gigantic trade in human flesh going on merrily. Murders, etc., continued to be perpetrated, tribes to be plundered, and hearts to be broken, of course legally and domestically, as well as piratically, during this rapid flight of time. But nearly everything in this life has its bright lights and half tints, as well as its deep shadows. During the same flight of time, humane individuals have continued to urge on the good cause of the total abolition of slavery, and Christian missionaries have continued, despite the difficulties of slave trade, climate, and human apathy, to sow here and there on the coasts the precious seed of gospel truth, which we can trust shall yet be sown broadcast by native hands, throughout the length and breadth of that mighty land. To come more closely to the subjects of our tale. Chimbolo, with his recovered wife and child, sought safety from the slavers in the far interior, and continued to think with pleasure and gratitude of the two Englishmen who hated slavery, and who had gone to Africa just in the nick of time to rescue that unhappy slave who had almost been flogged to death, and was on the point of being drowned in the Zambesi in a sack. Mokompa also continued to poetize, as in the days gone by, having made a safe retreat with Chimbolo, and among other things enshrined all the deeds of the two white men in native verse. Yambo continued to extol play, admire and propagate the life-sized jumping jack to such an extent that, unless his career had been cut short by the slavers, we fully expect to find that creature a domestic institution when the slave trade has been crushed and Africa opened up, as in the end it is certain to be. During the progress and continuance of all these things, you may be sure our hero was not idle. He sailed, as proposed, with Kambira, Azinte, Obo, Disco, and Jumbo for Zanzibar, touched at the town over which poor Senor Francisco Alfonso Toledo Bignosi Letotti had ruled, found that the Senhorina had taken her departure, followed, as Disco said, in her wake, reached the Cape, hunted her up, found her out, and presented to her, with Lieutenant Lindsay's compliments, the African chief Kambira, his wife Azinte, and his son Obo. Poor Maraquita, being of a passionately affectionate and romantic disposition, went nearly mad with joy, and bestowed so many grateful glances and smiles on Harold that Disco's suspicions were confirmed, and that bold mariner wished her, Maraquita, at the bottom of the sea, for Disco disliked foreigners, and could not bear the thought of his friend being caught by one of them. Maraquita introduced Harold to her aunt, a middle-aged, leather-skinned, excessively dark-eyed daughter of Portugal. She also introduced him to a bosom friend, at that time on a visit to her aunt. The bosom friend was an auburn-haired, fair-skinned, cheerful, spirited English girl. Before her Harold Seadrift at once, without an instant's warning, fell flat down, figuratively speaking, of course, and remained so, stricken through the heart. The exigencies of our tale require, at this point, that we should draw our outline with a bold and rapid pencil. Disco Lillihammer was stunned, and so was Jumbo, when Harold, some weeks after their arrival at the Cape, informed them that he was engaged to be married to Alice Gray, only daughter of the late Sir Eustace Gray, who had been M.P. for some country in England, which he had forgotten the name of, Alice not having been able to recall it, as her father had died when she was 4 years old, leaving her a fortune of next to nothing a year, and a sweet temper. Being incapable of further stunning, Disco was rather revived than otherwise, and his dark shadow was resuscitated when Harold added that Kambira had become Maraquita's head gardener, Azinte cook to the establishment, and Obo page in waiting, more probably page in mischief, to the young Senhorina. But both Disco and Jumbo had a relapse from which they were long of recovering, when Harold went on to say that he meant to sail for England by the next mail, take Jumbo with him as valet, make proposals to his father to establish a branch of their house at the Cape, come back to manage the branch, marry Alice, and reside in the neighbourhood of the Senhorina Maraquita Letotti's dwelling. "You means what you say, I s'pose?" asked Disco. "Of course I do," said Harold. "And you're goin' to take Jumbo as your wally?" "Yes." "I'll go too as yer keeper." "My what?" "Yer keeper, yer strait veskit buckler, for if you ain't a lunatic you ought to be." But Disco did not go to England in that capacity. He remained at the Cape to assist Kambira at the express command of Maraquita, and continued there until Harold returned, bringing Lieutenant Lindsay with him as a partner in the business, until Harold was married and required a gardener for his own domain, until the Senhorina became Mrs. Lindsay, until a large and thriving band of little Cape colonists found it necessary to have a general story teller and adventure recounter with a nautical turn of mind, until, in short, he found it convenient to go to England himself for the gal of his heart who had been photographed there years before, and could be rubbed off neither by sickness, sunstroke, nor adversity. When Disco had returned to the colony with the original of the said photograph, and had fairly settled down on his own farm, then it was that he was wont at eventide to assemble the little colonists round him, light his pipe, and, through its hazy influence, recount his experiences and deliver his opinions on the slave trade of East Africa. Sometimes he was pathetic, sometimes humorous, but, however jocular he might be on other subjects, he invariably became very grave and very earnest when he touched on the latter theme. "There's only one way to cure it," he was wont to say, "and that is to bring the Portuguese and Arabs to their marrow bones, put the fleet on the east coast in better working order, have consuls everywhere, with orders to keep their weather eyes open to the slave dealers, start 2 or 3 British settlements, ports of refuge, on the mainland, hoist the Union Jack, and last, but not least, send 'em the Bible." We earnestly commend the substance of Disco's opinions to the reader, for there is urgent need for action. There is death where life should be, ashes instead of beauty, desolation in place of fertility, and even while we write, terrible activity in the horrific traffic in Black Ivory. This is the end of Black Ivory, by R. M. Ballantyne. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com.